401. Chapter 401. If the looks on Vlad and Jessef's faces was anything to go by, Nick was not alone in his surprise and confusion, though likely for different reasons. Nick simply hadn't expected for the princess to speak at all during the negotiations, and thus frowned when she did. The two royal vampires, though, probably had very different thoughts on the matter. "I do hope that is a joke. I gain literally nothing of worth by doing so," Nick said honestly. "Power, speed, immortality, bloodline abilities, and vast wealth," Mina said to counter his argument. "I already have 3 of those things, and the other 2 aren't difficult to acquire, as I said nothing of worth. In fact, I would actually lose things by doing so, so I won't agree on this matter at all," Nick stated firmly, and the princess snarled in frustration. "Leave the room, daughter. You will not get what you seek from this one." Vlad spoke firmly, and the princess obeyed, though clearly unwillingly. "What a troubling development. It would seem my daughter has taken an interest in you, child. It is not in a romantic manner, thankfully, or she will have refused even my order to press the matter of your race further," Vlad said tiredly. "This won't become a problem, I hope, as I won't just sit back and endure abuse," Nick warned seriously. "So long as there is no violence involved, I do not expect you to do so. Regardless, you have said something that piqued my interest. You said you had 3 out of 5 of those benefits she offered, and yet I only know of 2, bloodline abilities and wealth. What is the last thing you have?" Vlad asked curiously. "I'll keep that to myself for now, but you'll no doubt find out eventually," Nick said with a chuckle. "Suit yourself, back to business. You never answered about yearly quota before my daughter interrupted us," Vlad said, getting back on topic. "I don't mind the quota so long as the equipment in question is not unreasonably complicated," Nick said calmly. "That shouldn't be an issue. So what price is needed to order a more improved version of the ring Jessef currently wears? Most wouldn't notice how inefficiently the conversion between the mana circuits and blood veins is, but I did. By my reckoning, the full mana circuit network should allow for at least 3 other bloodline abilities," Vlad pointed out calmly. "That original ring is merely a gift to show my own value to the royal clan, so I obviously left much to improve upon. As for the actual amount possible, then, it is exactly 3 extra abilities beyond the original 5. The conversion causes a portion of the magical circuits to be cannibalized in order to strengthen the new veins after all," Nick explained honestly. Vlad seemed to think about this information for a moment before nodding his head in agreement. "As for price, I need natural gems at the moment. The higher the purity and size, the better. They don't even need to be cut either, as the shape is irrelevant for what I will be using them for," Nick said seriously. "Doing some alchemy, are we? A rather dangerous topic for a student your age, isn't it?" Vlad teased. "Wrong guess, but I can see how you might come to that conclusion," Nick said with a smirk. "Oh. You certainly know how to create intrigue at the least, but as for the gems, would a fist-sized natural ruby of high purity suffice?" Vlad said, taking said ruby out of a leather bag on his waist. Nick tapped the table with his wand, and the ruby was shifted towards him so he could check it. It was a light red and rough gem that looked like it had been directly taken from a much larger piece. He closely examined the gem before nodding and sending it into his realm. "I assume sending the ring to Jessef will do after I finish it?" Nick asked, and the King of Vampires nodded. "Give me a few weeks, and I'll send over a method to contact me without getting tracked. I am outside of the Owl network as well, after all," Nick said before standing up. Nick took on his disguise once again, while Lucas did the same, and they left the building and Nocturne Alley swiftly after that. Mina tried to be sneaky and follow them, but Nick hit her with a stunning spell before Dottie apparated them away. Vampires were very magic resistant, so she was only out of it for a brief moment, but that was more than enough for Nick to lose her entirely. The nearby humans were then subjected to her anger after that, which resulted in 4 deaths, but in Nocturne nobody so much as blinked at it. 402. Chapter 402. With a pop, Nick and Lucas arrived on the island with Dottie, and both sighed in relief at their narrow escape. As the only royal vampire ever born, Mina's abilities were largely unknown beyond a few of her bloodline ones, so Nick wasn't entirely sure if she had noticed his uniqueness, and thus wanted him to become a vampire. While he didn't think his race was the most unique to exist in all of the multiverse, Nick was aware that it was, if nothing else, rather special. It had to be stated that at this point in time, he had the magical ability of this world's wizards, the body and soul of an elf and a celestial bird, as well as the essence of a Daedra from yet another world. His very existence was a strange fusion of three worlds at the moment, and he had no clue if that number may go up in the future. While vampires aren't a terrible option, for most wizards to become the same doesn't apply to me. Nick thought as he released his disguise, taking his true form once again. You can go about your normal work now. I need to get started on the communication device, Nick said to Lucas, who nodded and walked off. Darty had already left immediately after dropping them off, as like any good house elf, they had adapted to the normal way their master operated. Nick rarely had extra work for Darty after the task was done, so the house elf stopped waiting for more orders and merely waited until it was called again. Nick had an idea as to how he would set up the communication devices, but he needed a few things first to start. The first was the bonded connection enchantments that the vanishing cabinets used to bypass wards or secrecy charms. He obviously wasn't going to give the vampire royals a method to find and invade his island like the cabinets would, but the connection enchantment would allow him to send and receive messages to the connected item. The second thing Nick needed was to master and modify the protean charm. The original form of the spell was to bind multiple similar objects together so that any change on one was reflected on the others. This made it easy for the charm to allow for the passing of secret messages. Nick wanted to modify the charm slightly so that there were subsections of it that allowed him to receive multiple orders at once without them interfering with each other or vanishing when a new one comes in. Thankfully, this was less changing the way the spell works and more expanding its pre-existing functions. Such modifications were where Nick excelled, as it usually only took an extra word to achieve. The final thing Nick required was a few very special mirrors that had been alchemically treated with a few innate effects, specifically durability, self-repair, and enchantment potential. With these things obtained, Nick could create two-way transmission mirrors that stored messages and sent them as well that would allow his deal with the royals to proceed smoothly. Nick was able to take care of two of these things easily enough on his own, as the protean charm was an advanced NEWT level spell, and thus well within his skill to learn quickly. The second thing he could solve was the bonded connection enchantment of the vanishing cabinets, as he happened to know where two fully functional models existed. The first was in Hogwarts in the Room of Requirement after Peeves broke it, and the second was in Borgin and Burke's. Nick only needed a single working cabinet to study the enchantment on, so he summoned Darty and had it go and purchase the cabinet from Old Man Burke. The man thought he was ripping Nick off with his price, but Darty paid the sum asked for before bringing the cabinet to the island. 120 galleons for the chance to figure out how to create vanishing cabinets myself is such a steal. Nick thought with a chuckle as he set the cabinet in the realm for analysis. The biggest problem Nick had now, though, was getting the alchemically treated mirrors, as he didn't trust most of the English alchemists with such a thing. The level of teaching in Hogwarts on the subject was woefully lacking, as you could only start learning it in the 6th year, and had really high grades in several classes. That didn't even begin to cover that the class only was available if enough students showed interest in it. Unlike Nick, others didn't have the system that gave him all the books on a topic he could ever want, so self-study didn't tend to work out with others. 403, Chapter 403. If I can get a hold of a French alchemist, I could get this settled easily enough, but I lack any real contacts over there. Nick thought with a sigh before heading up to the newly refurbished study to draft a letter to Madame Maxime to inquire about a trustworthy alchemist. He had thought of seeing if Flammel would help him with it, but chose to discard that idea since the only method to contact the man he had at the moment was through Fawkes. Nick doubted Dumbledore would be amused if he just suddenly walked into his office to offload a letter on his familiar when Nick wasn't even supposed to be at Hogwarts right now. Sneaking onto the campus to use the workshop a few times was tolerable for the old goat, as he had plausible deniability since he never personally saw Nick there. The same could not be said if Nick just waltzed into his office to have Fox deliver a letter. With that understanding, Nick chose the second best option of having the owl service in Diagon Alley deliver the letter to Madame Maxim. The return letter will be a bit tricky since he himself was outside the owl's tracking abilities, but could be solved easily by having the owl service set up a postage box for him. Once that was taken care of, Nick turned his attention to the large ruby he had received from Vlad as payment for a perfected ability ring. With this, I should be able to create a rather powerful flame Atronak. I think it may even be strong enough to successfully take on the properties of cold flame. Nick thought with a smile as he started the blood binding process for the gem. Blood loss was easy to solve with potions, so Nick didn't mind the loss of it to bind these gems to him. It certainly helped that the soaking gems were guarded more heavily than a dragon would their eggs. There was nearly no chance at all of someone even making off with a single drop of blood like this. Still, the simplicity of this process meant that Nick had a few dozen magically grown gems all ready to be turned into Atronachs at any given time. Out of curiosity, he used the protean charm on 2 small magically grown sapphires before putting one of them through the process of becoming a frost Atronach. The result of this experiment made Nick excited, as rather than become an Atronach like its paired version, the other sapphire turned into frost salts directly. Nick had to kill a frost Atronach to test it, but the 2 piles of frost salts were indeed the same thing. This meant that Nick could not only create his normal 4 daily Atronachs, but also stockpile elemental salts at the same time. This discovery was huge for him, as he had his own experiments in mind for the salts, but didn't want to waste an Atronach to conduct them. For example, he wanted to know if the salts could be used as the core of a wand, and if so, whether or not they were a good one. Depending on the answer he received, he may have found a way to drastically improve his power. His wand, even now, was only mythical grade, and he wanted to push it a step further to legendary. He hadn't experimented with his wand until now, as it was a unique existence that he simply couldn't replicate should he damage it. Even now, he hadn't figured out what the wood used in its construction was other than what the system told him, which was sadly limited. Still, now that he had spare elemental salt, he could conduct a few experiments with it. He set the new Atronach on patrol with the others in his growing army before taking the salt into the nearby enchanting room. Rowena Ravenclaw had truly done a good job in setting up this room to the point Nick only had to make a few small updates to some things in order to render it perfect for any sort of enchanting research he may do. The room had a veritology bench set up against the back wall with plenty of high-quality tools to use. The first part of the experiment was testing the compatibility of the salts with each kind of wood he had available. He found that the frost salts agreed more with pine and ash woods than any of the others, so he moved on to the next step, core transference. After writing the runes on the inside of the wands, he carved up Nick carefully poured in a solid line of frost salts before sealing the wand shut. 404. Chapter 404. There was an immediate react from the wand, as it creaked and hummed loudly as the casing and core tried to sync up with each other. Sadly, this was when tragedy struck, and the wand crumbled under the power of the salts, causing the wood to fall apart, as if exposed to long-term frost. The frost salts themselves were pretty much unchanged, however, so Nick salvaged them while cleaning up the mess to try again. Again and again, Nick watched as the casings he made failed to withstand the power of the frost salts, as he changed small details each time. Less salt, extra elemental runes, larger wands. All of this and more were done to test exactly the parameters needed to have the wands not self-destruct. Nick even made a metal wand at one point to see if that would work, and quickly came to regret that as he got a new scar on his arm. The metal exploded in a shower of sharp shards that he barely managed to mostly avoid save one that stabbed into his right arm. The dense frost mana on the shard directly created a frost-bitten effect on his flesh, so even after using the flesh-mending spell, he had a large scar on his arm. The frost salts clearly did far worse when exposed to a dead material like metal, and so Nick made sure he wasn't going to be making that mistake again. Over the next 2 days, he tweaked the formula over and over again until he finally made a wand that didn't fall apart during the harmonizing stage. The wand was by no means perfect, as the wood was brittle and highly strained, but it was very much functional. So it is possible, but not applicable for what I wanted to use it for, so let's test out its power. He thought as he held up the wand and swished it, Verdimillious Trio, he said, and sparks fell out of the wand's tip frailly. Nick sighed when he saw this and immediately declared elemental salts unfit for wand making. He reclaimed the frost salts from the core of the wand and discarded the ruined casing as Dottie finally appeared with a return letter from Madame Maxime. Nick had sent her a couple of Nazgul's feathers in exchange for the name of an alchemist who did good work. The name he got was Leo LeBlanc, a Muggle-born alchemist that had even earned praise from Flammel for his work. Nick drafted up a new letter to this man, asking for a couple dozen treated mirrors, following his specifications, and sent some frost salts as a down payment. Nick very much doubted that any alchemist worth the name would pass up the chance to study or use elemental salts given their unique nature. Assuming it takes a day to arrive like it did for Madame Maxime, then I should get a reply within a week, depending on how busy he is. Nick thought before moving on to a different test with the frost salt. This new test was to determine how the salts would react if he solidified them into a single large crystal. The answer, as it turned out, was violently, as the moment he fused the small pile together, a biting cold was released from the frost crystal that nearly froze him solid had he not exploded out with fire instinctively. Fuck, that was close, he thought while breathing deeply to calm himself after he retreated out of the crystal's range of effect. The room didn't look any different, but the glowing white-blue crystal on the table had turned a small area around it into a dead zone for anything stupid enough to enter it. Nick quickly undid the spell that fused the salts together, and the crystal immediately broke down back into harmless frost salts. Well, at least I now have a trap that no one would see coming until it was too late, Nick thought while containing the salts again. He had a theory that when he joined the salt together, it corrupted the surrounding mana in pure cold mana, which explained why it seemed almost invisible to the naked eye. Nick chose to stop there for now, as the end of the month was coming, and he did still intend to invite his friends to the island. But before he could do that, he needed to set up some barriers to keep them from getting hurt or messing with something they shouldn't, like the Atronak Forge. He didn't intend to tell them about Lucas, though since he thought it would be pretty funny to see their reactions to the royal vampire working under him. 405. Chapter 405. Nick first set up a small barrier on the door of the Atronak Forge room that should keep out any overly inquisitive minds, like Hermione. He then repeated this process on a few other places, such as the Hydra's pond and the storage room. Once that was done, Nick called out Dottie, and with a loud pop, the house elf appeared. "What is your bidding, master?" the small servant asked eagerly. "I will be hosting a decently sized group of people for most of the next month, so I need you to stock up on the appropriate amount of food to feed such a group," Nick said calmly. "Master's friends from the school, yes?" Dottie asked, and Nick nodded, as well as 8 to 10 others at most. He added, and his servant nodded. "This should be an adequate amount for that amount of food," Nick said while taking out a small pouch of galleons and handing it over. Obviously, raw ingredients weren't actually that expensive in most cases, but Nick preferred rich, flavorful food, so he only purchased top-quality ingredients, and that did add up when it was purchased in bulk. Money was not really a problem for Nick, as not only did he have the Ravenclaw fortune, but he could make a stupidly high amount of money by selling his work on the open market. That was even keeping in mind that he didn't believe in price gouging his works and only charged what he thought they were worth. He, of course, had standards for these prices that he followed, but charging an arm and a leg for a steel ring that repels slugs or some other mundane thing didn't sit well with him. Anyways, with the food taken care of, Nick got to work writing out the invitations for his friends. Despite what they had said, he created one for each of them and added a few small details, depending on who the invitation was addressed to. For example, in Harry's, there was a line mentioning that Sirius was also welcome to come. For Daphne and Tracy, he specifically mentioned that only one of their parents were allowed to come as chaperones. This was because he really didn't want to deal with any political nonsense that those people would try. Luna's father was allowed to come as well. For Hermione and Ron, they were both allowed to bring their entire direct families. Nick wasn't worried about the adults causing any problems while they were here, since there wasn't much they could do that would really have an impact. They could report him until they were blue in the face to the ministry, but he was not breaking any laws by owning and living on the island without a guardian. This was thanks to the rather niche loophole in the laws that allowed a child to self-govern if they were the recognized lord of a household. Harry still had relatives in the wizarding world, and as such didn't qualify until he came of age to claim the Potter lordship. Even if a relative of Nick's were to come forward, it was too late to have someone become his guardian, since he was already the established lord of House Ravenclaw. So long as Nick didn't do anything illegal in plain view, he was basically untouchable, and he doubted his guests wouldn't also realize it. With these things all covered, Nick chose to relax until the 3rd of July, which he set in the letters as the date he will show up to get them all. By relaxing, what Nick meant was only doing work that was easy, such as mastering the Protean charm. He already had a pretty good grasp of the original variant of the spell, and could use it without much problem so long as the two items bound were similar enough. This just left him with needing to modify the spell in the manner he wanted, and everything would be perfect. Thanks to his magical senses, he could tell when the effect he wanted wasn't going to be achieved with each change he made to the original spell. Nick's bloodline abilities were skewed towards support rather than combat in 3 out of 5 of them, and were specifically geared towards learning magic in 2 of those cases. His magical senses made modifying spells way easier for him than normal, while his ability to read, understand, and speak any language meant he wasn't held back or slowed by the language barriers that most wizards need to struggle to overcome. Together, it made him frighteningly effective at accumulating power and knowledge, while he could modify nearly any spell on a whim. 406. Chapter 406. Still, the result Nick was after was significantly more complex than the normal version's effects, so it still took him until the night before he goes to get his friends to finish it. Protea loculamentum, he spoke, and the red spell landed on the stone marbles he was practicing on. Nick then transfigured one of the marbles, but the other remained the same. Then he changed it again, yet there was once again no shifts in the other marble. Nick then tapped on the other marble, Unius. He said, and the marble changed into the first transfigured form. Do, he then said, and the marble took on the second transfigured form that the first marble did. It works perfectly, so now I just need the mirrors and the bonded enchantment of the cabinet to finish up this method of communication. Nick thought before clearing away the marbles and yawning and going to bed satisfied with the spell. The next morning he woke up at dawn, as per his usual, and ate some Lember's bread for breakfast. He had a few aches and pains from the parts of his body that were growing, but he ignored them. These growing pains weren't anything new, but he had apparently hit a bit of a growth spurt in the last few days and gained 3 inches in that time. At 5 feet 3 inches, Nick was slightly taller than an average 13-year-old boy 2 months past his birthday would be. He wasn't freakishly tall or anything like that, though just a little taller than was normal. After eating, Nick got dressed in a set of jeans and a blue t-shirt covered by his favorite coat that Madame Maxim had gifted him at Christmas. His wand was in a sheath strapped to his waist if he needed it, and he double-checked to make sure he was good and ready. Finding nothing missing, Nick had Darty take him to the first stop of this trip, number 12, Grimmauld Place. Nick hadn't been to the place himself, but Darty had, thanks to the training that house elves get before they serve a master. Every publicly known noble house, and the magical district in London, is hammered into the house elves' heads so they can bring their masters there if need be. The Black Ancestral Home is one of those that is very well known by the public, and thus included in that list. Once he arrived near the place Sirius, and Harry lived at the moment, Nick couldn't help but chuckle at how accurate the building looked compared to the family that owned it. The Black family was one of the darkest in known wizarding history, and the building perfectly imitated this. Unlike the buildings on either side of it that were clean and normal-looking, the black building was just that, black as if burnt. Unlike how it was described in the books, though it didn't look abandoned or dirty, just dark. Nick walked up to the front door and used the large brass knocker to announce his presence to those within. Moments later, the most hideous thing he had ever seen opened the door with a sharp glare. It was a house elf with ragged ears, deep wrinkles, caked on dirt and other stuff, and this feeling of being a foot away from death on it. "You must be the filthy lord I was told to expect. You may enter, but no creature shall be watching your foul self," the house elf said with open hostility. Nick looked at the thing and spoke calmly. "To treat the one who destroyed that locket in such a way, it seems the House of Black doesn't train their servants properly," he said coldly, and the house elf looked horrified at the statement. Nick had directly struck the old house elf where it hurt the most by pointing out that it owed him a debt of gratitude, and yet mistreated him while stinging at the Black family name as well. "Creature swears he didn't know it was the great sir. Please forgive him while he punishes himself for sullying the family name with his actions," Creature said before bashing his head into the door frame over and over again, hard. "Enough! You are forgiven so long as you watch your tongue from now on," Nick said sternly, and the pathetic thing nodded hurriedly before stepping aside. "Gods, I wish that wasn't necessary. Better this than needing to watch my back around this damn house elf, though," Nick thought while keeping a straight face as he hung up his coat on the rack near the door. Sirius was sitting nearby and didn't seem to mind the vicious tongue lashing Nick gave Creature. In fact, he seemed pleased to see the thing suffer. 407. Chapter 407. "Come to my home, Nick. Please make yourself comfortable while we wait for Harry to get ready to go," Sirius said in a friendly manner while motioning to the nearby armchairs. "It seems my gift has done you quite a bit of good," Nick commented while sitting down. "Ah, yes. I can't thank you enough for that little trinket, as I was sick of those damn potions," Sirius said with a disgusted look at the mention of the potions. "I had thought as much when I made it, so I am glad it served its purpose well," Nick said honestly. "So what all is on this island of yours?" Sirius asked curiously. "Well, there is Ravenclaw Manor, of course, which is already pretty interesting in and of itself, but the best part of the island is easily the rest of the land. Old trees and powerful rare beasts cover the whole island. I even have a manticore living there," Nick said with a grin. "Sounds like we won't be bored, at least if the place is half as interesting as you say," Sirius said with a smile. "Yeah, if you are lucky, I might even finish making the next big magical sport while you are all there," Nick said with smirk. "Oh, what sort of sport is it?" Sirius asked, intrigued. "Do you know soccer?" Nick asked, and Sirius looked confused. "The muggle sport?" he asked while giving Nick a funny look. "Yep, so the sport is very similar to that, except it is held underwater and the use of hands is allowed. The basics of the game are that there are a total of 6 members on each team, and you are trying to get the most points by the end of the timer by kicking the ball into the opponent's goal. It's called Blitzball, and I think it will be quite popular once I hold a few games in Hogwarts," Nick said with a smile. Sirius closed his eyes to imagine what Nick described and smiled widely. "That sounds wicked fun if you can solve the water-breathing problem," he said eagerly. This was the moment that Harry shows up from upstairs dressed and with a small leather bag at his waist that Nick recognized as an expanded space bag. It's good to see that Sirius is treating him good. Hard to tell how some will do with the responsibility of a child after all, he thought, relieved. He hadn't thought that Sirius was abusing Harry or anything like that, but he wasn't sure exactly how Sirius was doing as Harry's guardian, since there was quite a lot of responsibility involved after all on top of his lordship. "You got everything you'll need for the next month?" Nick asked, and Harry nodded. "Yeah, we are ready when you are," he said with an excited grin. Nick placed them both in the realm and put on his coat before calling Darty to take him to his next stop, Hermione's house. It came as no surprise to him that her family's house was in a well-to-do neighborhood, considering her parents owned and operated a successful dentistry office. Despite not being the most glorious job, like that of a doctor or surgeon-dentist, was a profession that took money to get into, much less own your own business with. Hermione wasn't swimming in money, but she had a very comfortable living environment. She was ready to go the moment Nick arrived. and he stored both her and her trunk in the realm after she said goodbye to her parents. The next stop for Nick was to pick up Daphne and Tracy, who were at the same place in Greengrass Manor at the outskirts of Little Hangleton. Greengrass Manor was an impressive sight for Nick, if an uncomfortable one, as it was a large early Victorian manor that was positively covered in valuable and dangerous plants, both muggle and magical. There was even what Nick recognized as manchineal trees on either side of the gates to the manor grounds. That is certainly one way to dissuade unwanted visitors, he thought as he pressed the magical equivalent of a buzzer next to the gate. It did not take long at all for the gate to magically swing open and a small green-clothed house elf to appear to lead him and Darty to the manor. Nick had asked Darty to wait near him when he came to pick up everyone, since it would be annoying to have to call it back moments after it vanished. Nick gave all the plants a wide berth, since him and them don't mix well at all. Nick wiped his shoes on the doormat, as was polite, before entering the manor, all while vigilant of the wards that surrounded him. 408, Chapter 408. While he knew that he was perfectly safe, since he was invited into the manor, rather than if he entered without an escort, he honestly didn't trust Daphne's parents. During the previous wizarding war with Voldemort, they had refused to take a side, which wasn't bad or anything, but their other actions were not great, as they hiked up potion ingredient prices to profit off the war. Nick didn't mind being opportunistic, but there had to be boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. War profiteering is an actual crime in the Muggle side of the world for a reason after all. People like that are amongst the last Nick would trust not to pull anything funny while he was in their turf. Paranoia aside, the manor was rather nice, as it had plenty of old knickknacks from the family's ancestors. Daphne and her family were in the dining room eating breakfast with Tracy when Nick finally reached them. Nick couldn't help but notice the curse within the younger girl that shared most of her sister's features besides hair color. It was clearly malicious and actively weakened her with its presence. I can't believe I actually forgot to fix this thing. Then again, it probably slipped my mind with all that been going on, Nick thought with a sigh. Ah, Nick, good morning. We already have everything packed up and ready to go, so if you will give us a moment to finish breakfast, we can set off. Daphne said with a smile. Nick wasn't in a hurry, so he didn't mind standing nearby as he waited. They finished breakfast 5 minutes later, and Nick stored Daphne, Tracy and Daphne's father in the realm before hastily setting off for his next stop, Luna's house. The Lovegood house was a black-colored cylindrical building set on top of a hill near the village of Ottery St. Catchpole that had a stream at the base of it. There were various oddly placed plants in the front of the building, from dirigible plums to crabapple trees covered in holly at either side of the black wooden door to the house. An owl could be found resting amongst the branches of the right tree. Nick used the eagle-shaped knocker to announce his presence outside and waited for the door to open. After hearing a bit of shuffling within the house, the door opened to reveal Xenophilius Lovegood. That was today, wasn't it? No matter, my Luna is already packed up and ready to go. As much as I'd like to see the home of Rowena Ravenclaw for myself, I am much too busy with the Quibbler to spend a month away, Zeno said with a disappointed expression. You know, you could leave the island whenever you wanted, right? The month I stated in the letter was only for those that wanted to stay that long. Nick clarified, and Zeno's eyes lit up. That's wonderful. Give me a moment to grab a few days' things, and we can be on our way, the man said before rushing off into the house, leaving Nick at the door. After 15 minutes later, both Luna and her father showed up with a trunk that Nick stored in the realm with the others alongside the father-daughter duo. Finally, he could head to the nearby burrow that the Weasleys lived in, since it was fairly close by. The burrow was alive with activity, as the twins and Ron were being hurried back and forth by their mother to finish packing up their luggage, since they had put it off till last minute. Ginny and Percy were both already ready to go alongside their parents, and thus were peacefully eating breakfast with their father. Make sure you don't forget your toothbrushes, Molly Weasley yelled after her children as they scrambled to pack everything. It came as little surprise to Nick that the twins were the most prepared for this trip, and thus took less time to finish up. He waited patiently in the dining room after being invited inside. Molly Weasley was beside herself about his coat that was expertly tailored and wonderfully stylish. Once they were all ready to go, Nick put the whole family in the realm with their luggage with the others before having Darty bring him, and by extension them to the island. With a wave of his hand, Nick released all of his guests from the realm alongside their luggage. "I officially welcome you all to Ravenclaw Island," he said grandly with a grin as they adjusted to the surroundings. There was quite a lot of oohing and eyeing once they could really soak it all in. More than a few sets of eyes immediately went to the Atronax, patrolling the perimeter of the manor in curiosity and awe. 409. Chapter 409. "What are those things? I've never seen them in any book before," Hermione asked curiously, and everyone looked at Nick for an answer. "They are a sort of elemental construct that I call Atronax. They are my most recent achievement, in fact. Pretty cool, right?" Nick asked proudly after introducing the things to everyone. "They aren't alive, then?" Arthur asked seriously. Nick shook his head. "Not at all. They are much more like golems than an actual life form, since they are elemental magic give form and purpose." He explained calmly. "What all varieties do they have? Are you willing to sell any of them?" Florian asked eagerly. "At the moment, I have a few different kinds of flame Atronax, some frost Atronax, 3 wind Atronax, and several storm Atronax. As for selling them, I am sorry to say that due to the method used to create them, they're all bound to me exclusively," Nick explained honestly. "A pity. I was rather interested in that lovely blue flame variant there," Florian said, and Nick couldn't help but agree with his tastes, as it was definitely the most beautiful of all of the Atronax. At this moment, Seram walks out of the forest, causing everyone to stiffen in fear. "These are all guests, I take it?" the huge manticore asked calmly. "Indeed they are at the moment," Nick said equally calmly. "Sorry for the scare, everyone. This is Seram, the guardian of this island from any unwanted visitors who may come across it," Nick explained with a smile. "Bloody hell, I thought you were joking, mate," Ron says in amazement. "Nope, I was very much truthful about the things I said are on this island, so do remember to be careful while you are here. There are things that are decidedly less friendly than Seram here," Nick warns seriously. As if on Nazgul swoops down from the sky at her full size and lands on the ground, kicking up a bit of dust as she does so. The adults all looked worried for the children's safety up until Luna rushed over to Nick's familiar and showered her in attention with happy squeals. Nazgul looked intimidating, but it was pretty clear she was fairly friendly as she rolled over to let Luna rub her belly with contentment. For those of you who haven't met her, yet this adorable creature is Nazgul, my familiar and ruler of all the beasts on this island, Nick introduced calmly. "Must be quite powerful if she is higher on the food chain than a manticore like that," Sirius said while pointing at Seram for comparison. The manticore scoffed. "Compared to her, I may as well be a house cat in terms of danger. For all of your sakes, pray nothing angers her, or you may discover why that is," she warned seriously before leaving. "Stop making those faces. She's extremely even-tempered, as to this day, nothing has managed to anger her yet," Nick said reassuringly, which helped the adults relax after the rest of Nick's friends verified that he wasn't lying. "Enough of that. Please come in, and I'll show you to your lodgings for while you are here," Nick said brightly before walking over to the doors of the manor and pushing them open to reveal the inside of it. "Also, before I forget, this island is shrouded by a protective ward that prevents any signals from entering or exiting it, so the trace of the ministry does not apply here, so feel free to use magic as you wish while here," Nick added as he used magic to lift all the luggage. "Are you not concerned that the ministry might learn of this matter?" Arthur asked curiously. He worked for the ministry after all, and found it difficult to understand how Nick could so openly spit in the face of one of its laws. That law was created to protect the statute of secrecy, since most Muggle-borns return to that side of civilization during the holidays or summer breaks. However, did you know that if those same Muggle-born students were to cast a spell in a magical or isolated place away from Muggles, the ministry won't say a thing about it? It might seem like reporting me might do something, but it will not accomplish anything since there are no Muggles here, and this place is isolated from the outside world. In other words, while on this island, some laws can be ignored," Nick said casually. No one could argue with him, either, as he was right in that what the ministry doesn't know about it also doesn't care about. The thing that most of the adults were concerned about, however, was that Nick didn't care that what he was doing was technically illegal at all. 410, Chapter 410. The reasons and levels of concern over that were different between each adult, but the concern was shared by all of them nonetheless. That concern evaporated when they walked into the manor, however, as it was replaced by awe at what they saw. The large spherical conjunction flame Atronac that floated in the center of the reception area cast a warm and impressive scene for them. The whole manor was personally decorated by Nick to make the place much more lively and warm to be in. Nick smirked as they all looked over the decoration and fixtures of the reception area. The rooming situation is rather similar to Hogwarts in that the left side has rooms for the women, while the right has rooms for the men. There is plenty of free rooms to choose from as well, so there is no need to share at all, Nick said, and the groups split up to go find a room in the designated areas. The only ones who didn't do that was the twins that left to explore the rest of the house. Nick noticed that most of the group was more energetic thanks to the dense mana, but otherwise didn't seem to notice it. The only real exceptions were Harry, who looked confused about it, and Luna, who was looking at the mana directly with curiosity. Thanks to the Atronac, though no one seemed to notice the keystone set in a case under it. I'd say this is going just fine so far. I spoke too soon, it seems, Nick thought with a sigh, as he felt the barrier to the Atronac forge room getting messed with. Walking up the stairs, he was not at all surprised to find the twins poking and prodding the barrier with their wands in an attempt to get past it. Didn't anyone ever tell you that curiosity killed the cat? Nick asked with an amused look. Aye, but satisfaction brought it back, George said, and both of them grinned. Perhaps that cat may be that lucky, but I guarantee that anything I have blocked off like that is either top secret or will kill you, so maybe don't press your lucks, Nick said honestly. Which is this, top secret or deadly? They both asked at the same time with a burning curiosity. That room has a top secret thing in it that you wouldn't understand even if you saw it, but is important to me. If you want to see something cool, though, I can introduce you to my assistant earlier than the rest, Nick said with a tempting piece of bait at the end. The funny thing is that we know you're playing us, George said with a grin before Fred finished that thought, but it's working, lead the way. Nick chuckled at that and headed to the opposite side of the upstairs area and stopped in front of the material room that Lucas hangs out in nowadays while he studies. Opening the door, I found Lucas sitting on a pile of iron ingots shaped like a chair while he read a book. Lucas looked over the top of the book when he heard the door open before marking his page and setting the book to the side. "What you need, boss?" he asked while eyeing the twins curiously. "Bloody hell, mate, he's a vampire," the twins exclaimed at the same time in shock. Nick chuckled. Lucas meet the Weasley twins, pranksters extraordinaire and nosy guests. Twins meet Lucas, my assistant in training, royal vampire and wizard, Nick said with a grin. How in Merlin's saggy robes did you get a royal vampire to work under you? Fred asked in shock. He tried to pick my pocket, so I gave him a job with some rather hefty benefits. Isn't that right, Lucas? Nick said, and Lucas chuckled before nodding. A bit more complicated, but that's the rough of it, he said with his own smirk. Wicked, the twins said in unison, with amazed looks on their faces. Keep these two company for a bit while I go and get the rest of the guests settled in, Nick said before leaving the twins to bombard Lucas with questions. In the short span, he was dealing with the two nosy twins. The rest had picked out their rooms and gotten their stuff set up. Harry and Sirius were amongst the first to finish up thanks to the expanded space bag. They, much like the twins, also chose to explore the manor while they waited for the others. The rest of the adults finished shortly after that and socialized among themselves while the rest were putting their stuff away. 411, Chapter 411. Soon everyone finished up settling their things into the chosen rooms, and Nick spoke up after they gathered again. Now that everyone is settled in, I believe, I should go over a few ground rules that needed to be stated before I give the tour. First is that there are places on the island that have been blocked off for safety or privacy reasons, so should you come across them, leave the barriers alone, or I may be forced to ask you to leave early. Second is that while many things on this island are valuable, I would ask that you keep any harvesting attempts within reason. The ecosystem of the island is quite fragile, and I'd rather not need to manually adjust it. The final thing is more a warning than anything else, but if you value your safety, while you are here, do not under any circumstances attack the Atronachs. They are set to only retaliate if attacked, so they are harmless unless you do so. If you fail to heed this warning, I will likely need to save you from getting torn apart violently by the small army you saw previously. Any questions? Nick said firmly. What will we be doing while we are here? Ron asked curiously. Besides relaxing, I have a few activities planned to keep you all entertained, including a small competition using a rather well-known enchantment of mine. If you are lucky, you all may even be able to participate in the first version of a new magical sport I am working on. Nick explained with a smile. From the sounds of it, you seem rather confident in this new game of yours. Any details you are willing to share with us? Zeno asked, intrigued. Nick could understand his interest, as if he could get a head start on the reporting for this new sport. Then, should it take off in the rest of the wizarding community, the Quibbler will be a trusted source of information on the topic, even if it isn't the largest media source covering it. This alone will increase the viewers to the paper, which every news company wants. Unlike Quidditch that is played on brooms, my new sport relies mostly upon the players' own bodies and will be far more teamwork reliant for victory. Nick said before smirking, since he hadn't actually given any substantial details. Still, despite that everyone looked interesting except Sirius, who had a smug look since he actually had more details. Since no one has any questions regarding the rules, we can start the tour of the manor. Nick said with a smile before motioning for them to follow him. First, he went through the first floor areas and pointed out where the 4 restrooms in the manor were located, since that was important. After he was done with the 2 wings of the manor on the ground floor, he brought them back to the reception. Next, I will show you the ballroom and greenhouse, he said with a smile. Walking towards the back of the house on the ground floor, Nick pushed open the ballroom doors, and the group seemed surprised at how fancy it was with the high-polished floors and old stylish wall decorations. I assume you will be holding a ball here at some point in the future, yes? Florian asked with a glint in his eye. Nick shook his head. Not at all. The island and my home will never be open to the public for any reason. I have no need to host balls for something as fleeting as status or prestige when I get them by virtue of my heritage alone. Nick said with open disgust at the fact of his bloodline being what most wizards look at to determine his status. I see, Florian said with a disapproving look. Nick wasn't surprised to see this, considering he basically just announced that he hated the way purebloods did and saw things. Sirius, Zeno, and the adult Weasleys, though all looked approving of his attitude, but that wasn't really strange considering they were fairly progressive-minded individuals. Nick himself was considered as such based on the labels of the wizarding world. He firmly believed that effort, skill, and talent were far more important than a stupid thing like heritage. Anyways, after the ballroom came the greenhouse, and Nick's friends wasted no time at all ribbing him on how there wasn't a single plant in it. His black thumb was almost legendary in Hogwarts, as each herbology class he attended involved a constant war between him and the plants. It was such a strange flaw to have that few people could fail to be interested in it. 412. Chapter 412. Yes, laugh it up at my failings. I'll remember this when one of you screws up next time. Nick said with a huff at his friend's teasing. Oh no, whatever shall we do? Tracy asked dramatically with a teasing smile. Moving on, I'll show you all the much more interesting parts of the manor which can all be found upstairs. Nick said, changing the subject. Oh, are you going to show us your torture chamber or maybe a slave room? Tracy joked. Nick decided to mess with her and smiled. Oh good, you already know about those, so I can just skip them, it seems. That saves time. He said, acting like he was serious. Wait, I was just joking. Please tell me you don't actually have rooms like that, Tracy exclaimed in horror, which most of the others shared as well. Of course not. I repurposed those rooms already, Nick said with a chuckle. Why did you have them to begin with? Hermione asked, mortified at the idea. I'm not the one who built this place, and 1,000 years ago that was perfectly normal, Nick said with a shrug. The group calmed down with that explanation, but definitely thought less of Rowan a Ravenclaw than they did before. Today's age, those sort of things were heavily frowned upon as barbaric and crude, despite being very common 1,000 years ago, like Nick had said. He had an idea of this shift in opinion, but didn't care since she was dead and couldn't defend herself or the practices of that long-ago time. Anyways, Nick led the group upstairs and went towards to right wing immediately, which made the twins grin to themselves. This room is where I keep most of my more mundane materials for crafting, and at the moment, he paused as he pushed open the door. Where my assistant Lucas spends most of his time, Nick said with a smirk. Lucas waved from his iron seat. These the rest of your guests, boss? He asked curiously. Nick nodded and made the same introduction as he had with the twins. Whatever he is paying, I'll triple it, Florian said eagerly, but Lucas scoffed. I very much doubt it, but sure, let me list off the benefits I get. All the dragon blood or money I could want, the prestige and respect of working for House Ravenclaw, the chance to learn his full crafting knowledge, and the ability to cast spells again. Lucas said disdainfully, and everyone's jaws simultaneously dropped. They all turned to look at Nick, but he was grinning widely. What? I believe in treating my employees well, he said casually, but it was clear to all of them that he was taking great joy out of flipping their world upside down. Florian in particular looked dreadful, as he was feeling a mix of shame and anger at what just happened, in addition to shock at what he learned. Shame because despite being a guest in Nick's home, his greed made him lose reason and try to poach his host's employee in front of them. He was angry, though, as he realized that he had made a fool of himself for no reason at all, since there was no way he could match the conditions Nick provided Lucas, much less triple them. All of this was trumped by the shock of learning that Nick had solved the one thing that made vampirism a huge downgrade in most wizards' opinion, the inability to cast spells normally. This was earth-shaking news, but if it got out, but Nick clearly didn't care, which probably meant he wasn't afraid of the sort of attention this would bring him if it got out. Just how much has he hidden from the world? Florian thought with a chill, once he realized the whole world seemed to have misunderstood where Nick stood in the world. Florian was the head of the Grey faction of the Wisengamot, and had been a political figure for decades now, so he understood the horror of hidden power better than any normal wizard. A good example of hidden power was none other than Dumbledore, who, despite being hailed as the greatest white wizard alive, had an unknown upper limit of power both politically and in magic. Unlike the old wizard, though, Nick was far less public a figure, and thus Florian had no clue the sort of things he was capable of. If Nick knew that he was being compared to Dumbledore, he would likely have a funny look, as he had been ignoring the similarities this entire time. He knew of them, but was subconsciously separating them, as if no comparison could be made. 413. Chapter 413. Why don't you seem concerned about Lucas's ability to cast spells getting out? Arthur asked, confused. I have a deal with the Teeps vampires, and can handle anyone else that thinks they can force the secret out of me. Well, except perhaps a handful of people, but they probably wouldn't care about it to begin with. Nick said confidently. He wasn't lying either, as thanks to his natural mana growth, he was on the lower end of the third tier of power at the moment. He was also nearly constantly polishing his skills, which set him as weaker than Sirius or Lupin, but with his crafting, he was far more dangerous. He had over a dozen defensive artifacts on him at any given time, and had powerful perception of his surroundings. He might not be able to defeat truly powerful individuals in a fair fight, but he had a whole bag of tricks that made it possible by unfair means. It's illegal to give a non-human race a wand or teach them magic, though. Arthur argued seriously. That only applies to those races that weren't human originally, or werewolves wouldn't be allowed to use wands either, and Lucas is a Hogwarts graduate. Nick said unconcerned. He had this bad habit of tiptoeing around the laws of the ministry in a dangerous manner that he was helpless about if he wanted to get things done. Arthur didn't continue arguing when he noticed that Nick was technically correct, but was still worried about it. He worked in the ministry and was thus more than aware about the corruption and unfairness of it. Onto the next room then, the enchantment room. Nick said, changing the subject. He then led the group to the enchantment room that was nice and organized. They all looked for anything special about the room that might give a hint about how his crafting style worked, but there was nothing at all save the strange blue glowing salt in a jar on the woodworking table. "What's that?" Fred asked curiously. "Frost salt, a byproduct of an Atronach being destroyed. Powerful stuff with dense, cold, magical properties that only I have access to," Nick said calmly as he summoned a small orb of water before dropping a pinch of salt into it. The group watched in interest as the water flash froze before falling into Nick's hand waiting underneath it. "I'm still experimenting with its uses, but I have removed the possibility of using it for a wand core. It's too powerful for it, and the resulting wands are terrible at channeling magic," Nick said while tossing the orb of ice to Sirius, who looked confused when he held it. "It's not cold," he muttered just loud enough for everyone else to hear. "What? No way, let me see that," George said before snatching the orb from Sirius, yet was also left confused by the lack of cold from it. "Merlin's beard, it isn't cold," he exclaimed in shock. "I haven't quite figured out why that is, but I believe it's because the frost salt is not letting any heat enter the orb, thus you aren't feeling any escape either. Still a work in progress, as you can see," Nick said, banishing the orb. "And you have those salts for each kind of Atronach?" Florian asked with a gleam in his eye. "I do. Why?" Nick asked suspiciously. House Greengrass is one of the major potion ingredient farmers and suppliers for the British Isle, and these salts look to be a promising prospect in the field of potioneering. I would like to discuss the distribution of them for a modest cut, of course," Florian said with his best salesman smile. Daphne looked like she wanted the floor to open up to swallow her after the way her father has been this entire time. "I have no intention of distributing these for profit, but if I change my mind, I'll keep you in mind," Nick said politely, but firmly. Florian didn't seem bothered by the rejection and nodded as if that was fine with him. Nick moved on with the tour after that and pointed out the bathroom that seemed to interest the women especially, as well as the barrier to the Atronach forge room. Finally, Nick showed them a nearly empty room that had a strange-looking table in the middle of it that looked like a miniature Quidditch pitch, but far fancier. "This little beauty is the first activity I have planned for everyone, the broomstick tournament," Nick said with a wide smile, but the reception was completely flat. He sighed. "I suppose I should have expected that. Anyways, this lovely thing here is a hyper-realistic miniature Quidditch simulator that is basically a much more advanced form of my Playmaker enchantment, with a single exception. Multiple people can play together," he said, and smiled as he finally got the reaction he wanted: excitement. 414. Chapter 414. "I have heard rumors about those Playmaker rings and always wondered why you hadn't sold them in bulk, but it seems you had your eyes much higher than that," Florian said while admiring the craftsmanship of the table. "I admit I had thought about selling the Playmaker rings on a larger scale, but the time such an effort would demand is simply not worth it at the moment," Nick said honestly. "The wizarding world is rather odd in that the prices of items have less of a set price in most cases, and rather a personally set price. Obviously, commercially sold things like ingredients and textbooks are different as they have set prices, but for things created one by one like Nick's Playmaker rings, it was whatever he chose to charge for them. Sure, he could charge an arm and a leg for anything he made due to things like rarity or even personal bias, but he chose a simpler method. Form, function, and effort were what he used to determine the price of his works. Form referred to the materials used and the complexity of the design the ring had. Function was all about what the enchantment did, and effort was how hard it was for him to create the ring. Things had escalated drastically after he got the Celebrimber style, as he had trouble objectively gauging what to charge for his works, as what was easy for him to achieve was much, much harder for normal enchanters. This left Nick with no real choice but to try and figure out how much lower the price for his works are compared to normal enchanters. "Anyways, I created this table specifically for when I have guests over and not to sell," Nick added while dismissing his introspection. "How many people can play at once?" Harry asked curiously as he looked over the table. "One person for each player on a team, so 14 total," Nick said with a grin. "But there's 16 people here," Hermione said with a frown. I myself won't be playing, and so there is only one person left out in truth, Nick said with a shrug. I also won't be participating, since I am not one for the sport either, Percy said honestly. Well, that pretty much solves that problem now, doesn't it? The way to use the table is fairly simple, as you merely need to place your hand on one of the 14 gems studded along the side, and it will do the rest, Nick explained with a smile. Everyone except him and Percy eagerly approached the table and placed their hands on the gems that lit up immediately. 7 miniature versions of each person appeared in midair above the table on broomsticks with a letter above their heads, specifying which position they were playing. Nick hadn't explained that the gem chosen determined who played what position, so even the actual Quidditch players were in a position they weren't used to. For example, the twins that were the beaters of the Gryffindor team were both chasers, while Harry was the keeper instead of his usual seeker position. Interestingly, the teams were almost perfectly split between adults and children, with the children minus Ginny on one side and the adults on the other, with Ginny as the odd man out. Thankfully, though she was a chaser, and thus not all that important compared to the keeper and seeker positions. Bloody hell! It looks like I am actually playing Quidditch, Ron said in amazement. Of course it does. The avatars are based after whoever is playing them at the time, and much like the original enchantment, you merely need to use your mind to control your avatar. Try it, Nick said helpfully. It was rather funny to see each of the avatars do twirls or barrel rolls all at once. Once everyone is comfortable with controlling the avatars, let me know so I can start the game, Nick said, and got a few immediate confirmations on how handling the game. It was no surprise that the actually players were amongst that number, considering they had experience from the rings that every member of the Gryffindor and Slytherin teams had. After about 5 minutes, the rest were also comfortable with how to use their avatars, and Nick pressed in the center of the table that was also the center of the Quidditch field, and the game started immediately. First, the Quaffle and Bludgers were released, and there was a scramble as both sides tried to get possession of the scoring ball while avoiding the flying dangers that were the Bludgers. The Seekers of both sides, on the other hand, that was Sirius and Daphne, flew above the rest of the players as they scanned the field for the snitch. 415. Chapter 415. A hidden feature that Nick added, however, made sure the minimum length of a game possible was 10 minutes, as the snitch wouldn't appear until that time. This was to allow the other players to really enjoy the game without having to worry about it being cut short. Thanks to the way the game was played, you didn't actually need any skill on a broom to win in this version of Quidditch, which let people like Ron, with a lot of theoretical knowledge, on the sport shine, despite his lacking broom skills. It showed, too, as Ron playing as a beater was proving to be a menace, as he zipped about the field, redirecting the Bludgers towards the other team's chasers. The most impressive thing, though, was how he was able to pull off advanced maneuvers like launching boom and even splitters. A splitter in Quidditch was a dangerous move that involved accelerating towards another player, but jumping off the broom before impact, causing the broom and person doing it to miss the other player before landing on the broom and continuing to play. This maneuver was most often used when a bludger was on course to hit the person who did it, and they wanted to pass it off onto the opposing team's player. None of the adults were stupid, though, and only fell for this trick a single time before wising up and keeping Ron at bay. Still, by the time the snitch appeared on the field, in the form of a very small version of the normal, one both teams had gained and lost points from scores and fouls. Daphne was clearly a better seeker than Sirius, as she found the snitch first and shot after it, with the old dog chasing her nearly immediately afterwards. Ah, so that's what he's playing at. How clever. Nick thought as he saw what Sirius was doing. The man had apparently decided that he wasn't going after the snitch, but was rather going to play interference to stop Daphne from getting it. This was a fairly popular strategy if a seeker wasn't confident in testing their skills against another seeker, but tricky to pull off. The reason for that was because once the chase for the snitch started, and the other team notices this set of actions, the beaters start ignoring all other players on the other team and focusing on the interfering seeker. This caused the game to escalate into a dangerous match of trading bludgers, which tends to stop the rest of both teams from scoring as the bludger start moving in dangerous, unpredictable wide arcs. Despite being virtual characters, the avatars only get 2 lives if the avatar gets damaged in a manner that would take them out of a game normally. This meant that each person still needed to play smart and cautious to prevent getting taken out of the game entirely. Sirius was actually doing really well despite this, as he was using feints and well-timed dodges to avoid the bludgers. The clever thing that Nick noticed was that he was using dueling movements to achieve this, which was an interesting way to play. Daphne was no slouch either, and kept a perilous but firm flight pattern towards the snitch that forced Sirius to limit himself lest he gets too far away from her to intercept her. It should be mentioned that all the avatars were using brooms with identical stats, so equipment played little part in the gameplay. This game lasted a total of an hour before Daphne pulled a sneaky move and slipped away from Sirius enough to snatch the snitch and end the game at 170 to 68. Blast! We were actually almost caught up when you caught the snitch, Sirius complained to Daphne. Maybe you should have focused on catching the snitch instead of on me then, she said smugly. Ugh, rematch, Sirius demanded like a sore loser. Afraid I'll have to pass on that idea. Florian said, and the rest of the adults agreed with him. How am I supposed to play without a full team, though? Sirius asked in dismay. You can just use the default players that are part of the game. You will even be at both an advantage and disadvantage, since you can take control of any position on the team at any given time like this. Nick explained, and Sirius grinned. You're the best kid, he said with a wide grin. You all may want to hold off on any more games, though, until I show you the other stuff I have set up, Nick said, and the entire group looked interested. 416. Chapter 416. Now that you mention it, what else is there for us to do? Daphne asked curiously. The next activity I have set up is in another room, so we should head over there before I can explain it, Nick said with a smile. He had set up a few different means of entertainment for guests in the manor over the time he had been working in it that weren't all that complex but could easily occupy someone for days to weeks. The group left the room with the broomstick tournament table and walked down the hallway to the final room there. Pushing the door open, there were gasps at what was inside it, as to the naked eye it appeared to be a massive void of darkness. What is this? Tracy asked, confused and a little afraid after they stepped into the room. Welcome to the Black Room, or the Story Room if you would prefer, Nick said, and with a wave of his hand, the room's look shifted into a space view of the Earth with stars, the sun, and everything. Ooh, the group said simultaneously in awe. This room works to bring whatever you imagine to life as a scene much like this. But only one person at a time can use the room at a time, Nick explained proudly. The enchantment worked based on a mixture of legilimency and illusion magics, projected in a visual manner from every corner of the room to create a realistic version of the user's imagination. In this case, Nick was projecting his memory of what the view from space looked like, since it would have the biggest impact. This room reads minds, Florian asked in horror before the telltale signs of occlumency show up on his face. Not in the manner you are thinking of, no. The enchantments of this room instead only pick up the thoughts that the person using it project outwards, like if that person were trying to share a memory with another, similar to how a pensive works. Nick explained calmly before changing the view to that of the merfolk city in the Black Lake from his memory. Incredible. It's almost like seeing this place personally. This room must be incredibly valuable, right? Arthur asked in amazement. I admit it was a little tricky to create, but besides time and a small amount of effort, it didn't cost me much at all, Nick said honestly. Would anyone like to give it a try? He asked with a smile. It can create anything we can imagine, right? Sirius asked with an almost hopeful look. Nick nodded. Yes, but remember that nothing you conjure up is real, no matter how you may wish it, he said sternly. That is fine so long as I can see them again in more than a photo, Sirius said with a sad look. Nick sighed, but cut the connection to the room and let Sirius have it. Immediately the room went black again before Sirius finally found what he wanted and actualized it. The scene changed into a sunny day in Godric's Hollow that was blurry in the distance, but that wasn't the focus of this projection. No, that belonged to a young group of 3 men and 1 woman having a picnic. Harry recognized all of the faces, and a look of realization and sadness came over him. This was a memory of his parents and the rest of the marauders from Sirius's point of view. The man himself wept with a sad smile as he viewed this image, but no one said anything even as he just stood there watching the scene play out. This was the last peaceful day we had before we joined the war against Voldemort and those Death Eaters, Sirius said before the scene vanished and was replaced by a dark and cold night scene that Nick hurriedly cut off with his authority over the room. No one needed to be told what it was that had started to appear, as everyone knew the day very well. The day Voldemort's reign ended, and the worst day of Sirius Black's life. Just seeing that memory made manifest of a happier time was enough for the pain and regret of that night, a decade ago, overwhelm him and start to manifest in the room. That was a bad example of the room's abilities, but this room could bring any fairy tale you can imagine to life as well. Nick said before reconnecting to the room and bringing up a bright and cheery forest with singing birds and peaceful deer. He rotated the day and night, created flying fish, and all sorts of wondrous spectacles in order to take their minds off what they had previously seen with Sirius. 417. Chapter 417. For the more active amongst you, the next room will be of particular interest, as it is a little competition I set up that doubles as an accurate gauge of where you stand in magical combat. Nick explains after his show. How's that work exactly? Fred asked curiously. The room we are going to create a set of targets based on what it is set on that you need to destroy for points. If you get hit with an attack, instead it costs points off your total, and once the level is complete, you get a final score that is color-based to show where you stand skill-wise at that level. There are currently 9 levels of difficulty based on each year of Hogwarts, and the final 2 are where I believe graduated wizards as a whole should be scored. The 3 colors are green, which is excellent, yellow, which is average, and red, which is failing. Your score is based on your points, so there are different levels to each of the colors as well, so the only way to surpass the person higher on the scoreboard is to have a better score, or if they have a perfect score, be the first person to do so. Nick explained with a smile. He was quite proud of the dueling room as it took the arcade shooter scoring system to the next level so that it was actually useful for wizards to polish their combat skills. Sounds like the sort of thing that the Aura's office would want, to be honest, Arthur says with an interested expression. Hadn't thought about it until now, but I suppose you are correct. This next room would indeed help them in training their members greatly, Nick said with a thoughtful expression. Perhaps I can create a few training rooms like this for the Ministry to bolster the effectiveness of the Auras in combat. Might even come in handy when the violence of the wizarding world getting exposed to the Muggles happens. He pondered as he pushed open the door to the space-expanded room that looked like a forest at the moment. Undetectable expansion charm, Florian asked in surprise. Not this time. This room is actually a very well-made illusion field that shifts with the people in it to make so that you never actually move out of its center after entering it. Nick explained calmly. How do we leave then? Luna asked curiously. The door is a permanent fixture regardless of what the surroundings appear to be, so it is as simple as merely walking out. This map, though, is part of the 7th year level, though since I forgot to rest it, Nick said before tapping the space to the left of the door with his wand, causing a key to appear inside a socket. Grabbing the key and pulling it out, the room turned into a normal-sized one with stone walls and 9 keyholes side by side next to the door. This key serves as the central point for all 9 of these enchantments that represent the levels. So long as this key is missing, each enchantment is inert and incomplete, but when the key is added, it activates. I had to do this since I haven't figured out how to stack separate complete enchantments quite yet, so this was the best I could do. The walls are also lined with hagstone to prevent any spells from doing structural damage, so in theory you all shouldn't break the room without seriously trying to, Nick explained before holding out the key for anyone who wanted to give the room a go. Fred took the key and mischievously slotted it into the final keyhole, causing the room to shift to a modern version of London, except on fire and devastated and devoid of life, save a person in a black robe with a skull mask not far away. A Death Eater. Everyone except Nick instinctively took out their wands, but the figure didn't move. Only an illusion, everyone. Also, the simulation won't start until any spectators have their wand put away, since it is a single-person activity. Nick said, and everyone relaxed. Why one of those people, though? Sirius asked, while glaring at the image of the Death Eater. Because this is the highest difficulty, and so anyone on this level should be a seasoned fighter capable of handling the average Death Eater, with the final opponent of the level being a powerful one, such as your cousin Bellatrix. Nick explained honestly. Your standards are awfully high, aren't they? Florian asked, clearly unnerved even by the illusion of a Death Eater. True combat is not a gentle place, so I won't coddle anyone in training for it. This entire game is a test of skill, after all, so if anything, my standards are quite reasonable. Nick argued firmly. 418. Chapter 418. If you'd like, I suggest starting from the first setting and working your way up until you start to get challenged. No one will be able to take first place on the scoreboard until the 7th level, however, since I have the perfect scores for all the previous levels. Nick said while taking out the key and placing it in the first slot. The room immediately changed to appear like they were standing in a field with a single child standing in the distance. So you are at the 7th year level, huh? Sirius said, impressed. The rest of the group minus Nick's friends mirrored that opinion, but Nick shook his head. I am only at that level in terms of pure spellwork and athletics, since that is all that counted in this room. In other fields, I am far more advanced, but that is a given considering what I have accomplished so far. He said honestly, and they all nodded in agreement. His progress in enchantment alone was monstrous compared to his age, and they all knew it, but regardless, a third-year student being able to match a 7th year in terms of spellwork and athletics was very impressive. Luna, why don't you show off for your father a bit to set the example? Nick suggested, and the blonde tilted her head in thought for a moment before nodding and frolicking forward. Are you sure this is safe? Zeno asked, nervously, since he feared for Luna's safety. After his wife's passing, the man was rather protective of his daughter and would go to extreme lengths to ensure her safety. Not to worry, this is all based on illusions, so even when a spell hits her, she won't actually get hit with a spell. Nick said reassuringly. Luna was completely relaxed when she finally got within distance of the faceless child and immediately drew her wand, Defindo. She spoke and defeated the illusion instantly. Another took its place a moment later and attacked with a blue spell bolt, but missed Luna entirely without her even needing to move. She tore through the first level easily and unsurprisingly got a perfect score, putting her name under his own on the scoreboard. Nick wasted no time moving the key to the second slot and letting her start that level as well. Much like the first, Luna had no trouble at all clearing the second level with a perfect score and moving on to the third. To the surprise of many of the adults, she aced that level as well with seemingly no trouble at all. Sirius, however, noticed a small falter in her movement from the final illusion opponent's faint attack. It was small and didn't really take away from her clear skill, but thanks to it, he could roughly guess that she should be around the 5th year level in terms of spell work and dueling. This was quite surprising to him, since he could tell that Nick didn't pull any tricks at all to improve her score. If all of them are at a similar level, then by the time they graduate, they might be able to give a skilled aura a run for their money. Sirius thought, impressed. If Nick knew what's serious, though, he would shake his head, since the only ones out of the group with such skill was Luna, Hermione, and Harry. He didn't count himself in that number due to his rather unfair advantages over them that excluded him from any normal measurements. The 4th level finally got Luna to show some real effort to ace, but the 5th, much like Sirius had guessed, was her limit, as she averaged out at that point. Luna seemed unhappy at this result and was pouting when she walked back to the group. My little Luna is so ferocious. Zeno fawned over her, which seemed to bring her mood up if the proud look she got was any indication. Nick reset the difficulty. Who wants to go next? He asked, and everyone seemed eager to give it a try. Tracy went next after settling the matter with rock, paper, scissors. Compared to Luna, her performance was lackluster, as she averaged out at the 3rd level, but Nick expected as much, since she didn't have nearly as much practice in that regard as Luna or Harry. Speaking of Harry, he went after Tracy, and got to show off his innate talent in the subject as he got to the red score of the 6th level before he was overwhelmed and finished the level. Despite that, he showed visible improvement during his run of the room as he fixed the small flaws he found as he went. His talent in dueling is greater than my own, but he lacks the mastery of spell work to really make it shine. Nick thought with a smile. 419. Chapter 419. After Harry was done with his attempt at the room, Sirius chose to give it a try, but complained when Nick skipped all the previous levels and placed the difficulty directly at the 8th level. If you aren't better than a 7th year by default, you have failed as a wizard, Nick said sternly. Can't argue there, I suppose, Sirius said with a shrug before taking his place in front of the faceless illusion of his opponent. With a wave of his wand, a red bolt of energy flew forward, but was blocked by a Pratigo shield. Back and forth, Sirius traded spells with the illusions while being careful not to get hit until the final opponent of the level was defeated, and he took the perfect score for this level. He didn't continue, however, as he freely admitted that that level gave him more trouble than he expected, and he knew he couldn't get a perfect score in the next level. I need to shake off this rust first, he stated with a shrug. Nobody blamed him, though, since it had been nearly a decade since he last had to fight seriously, and his body was horribly out of shape. I believe that is enough of a demonstration for this room's capabilities, so how about we go take a look at the final thing I have currently set up to entertain you while you are here, Nick said, before resetting the room and leading the group out of it. Truthfully speaking, I can't imagine we will grow bored with just the things you have shown us already, much less if there is even more, Marley Weasley said honestly. Nick shrugged. You are probably right, but I prefer to be prepared for the off chance you do get bored, he said honestly. The final room was a bit special in comparison to the others, as it was actually an expanded space that was quite large and had a huge body of water in it that was crystal clear. This is the swimming room at the moment, and as you can see, is full of pure fresh water that is kept at a nice warm temperature to aid in relaxing. If you are all lucky, you may even get to witness me finishing my new sport in here as well, Nick said with a smirk. Oh, so the sport has something to do with water then? Zeno asked, interested in this small piece of information on it. Nick just smiled, but didn't confirm nor deny that at all, since it would ruin the surprise. That is everything I have set up for guests, so you are all now free to disperse until 12 when lunch is served, Nick said, and the group did exactly that. This hosting thing that he was doing was a long-term thing lasting about a month, so he wasn't needed for every moment of it. With everyone occupied, Nick had Darty drop him off at the workshop in Hogwarts to quickly craft the ring that Vlad had already paid for before coming back to the island. It came as little surprise to Nick that out of all of his guests, the twins were by far the most troublesome, as they regularly got caught up in the most insane situations over the next week. He wasn't sure how, but they had somehow even managed to obtain a Griffcat cub from the colony on the island. They didn't even steal the thing either, since Nick checked, and the colony was completely fine with them taking it. The cub was a scrawny thing with bright red feathers, and the worst case of bed hair Nick had ever seen on a feline creature. At first Nick thought it may have been a runt or something, but he found the actual runts and ruled it out entirely afterwards. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley were less than thrilled about their children's new pet, however, but couldn't really say anything about it after the twins exposed that they had a stash of a few hundred galleons from selling services and joke items at Hogwarts. The dueling room had proven to be the most popular during this time, as well as everyone had used it at least once a day in order to try and beat their high score. Zeno left at the end of the week, promising a wondrous article in the Quibbler on the island. Besides all the chaos that the twins brought to the island, the first week was comfortably quiet and filled with entertainment. As an added bonus for Nick, the French alchemist, he had sent the frost salts to finally replied, eager to obtain more in exchange for his services with the mirrors. 420. Chapter 420. Nick woke up on Monday after the week restarted and felt that something was off in a sort of intuitive manner that he couldn't explain. Everyone was perfectly fine on the island too, as he checked immediately. None of the barriers were missing, and besides Lucas, everyone else was sleeping. But Nick had this feeling that something was still wrong. He quickly raised his wand and fired a blast of fire behind him while leaping forward when he found what was wrong near the Hydra's barrier. There was a spot that had no mana at all in a location filled with the stuff. It wasn't that there was something extra in his surroundings that was trying to blend in, but rather that there was something missing instead. I almost fell for this trick too. Who is this person? Nick thought seriously as he steadied himself after he stared at the spot of wrongness. Smack, smack, smack. Sound of hands clapping came from what appeared visually to be empty as the air rippled, and a man literally stepped out of thin air. The man had pale skin and heterochromatic eyes, with one being blue and the other black. He also had short grey hair and a thick grey goatee. Nick would need to be blind not to notice the striking similarity to himself the man had, and frowned as he sent out a call to Nazgul through his connection to her. Whoever this is, I doubt I can handle them without Nazgul's assistance. He thought sternly. I must say that you are far more paranoid than anticipated, nephew, the man said smoothly. Bombarda Maxima, Nick said without hesitation while overcharging the spell. Boom! A thunderous explosion struck the man's position and decimated it. Crackle! Electricity sounded out as Nazgul appeared from her elemental teleportation at her full size. That was rather dramatic, don't you think? The man said as he reformed from smoke. He has an ability like mist form. Guess I'll use that spell then. Nick thought and swung his wand in a wide arc, impetus tempestatis. He spoke, and the man's eyes widened a fraction of a second before a massive whirlwind of air formed around him and began to tear at his body like knives. Fuck! Tarnitrium! The man yelled as he drew his own wand, and a blast of air exploded from around him, clashing with Nick's spell and countering it. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't expecting you to have a counter to that ability, but you have proven to be full of surprises. Let's see you counter this then. The man yelled as his left eye changed shape into a silver reptilian eye. Nick felt a force act upon his very soul, and it filled him with rage as he grabbed it and sent a reverse attack through the connection. Ag! The man screamed in agony as his eye ruptured several veins, and the attack struck his soul. Nick waved his wand, Legilimens. He spoke, and a mind probe shot out of his wand and into the man. Immediately he was confronted by thick occlumency shields that were expertly crafted and defended against his magic for all of 2 seconds. That was actually very impressive when you consider that Nick's legilimency was regularly trained on powerful natural occlumens like Dusk and Nazgul that had defenses far stronger than any known wizards. It was considered nearly impossible to read the mind of a magical beast like a ho-ho by the magical community, but Nick trained his legilimency against that level of defenses. The man scowled while forcing himself to ignore the pain of his soul when he felt his mental defenses start to crumble. You've not seen the last of us, boy, he said ominously before activating a device on him. The very space tore apart where he was standing, and the man was sucked into the chaos between dimensions. Before the tear in reality could close, though, Nazgul unleashed a powerful gout of purgatory flames into it. Ag! The man's screams left the tear as it closed, leaving Nick in a terrible mood, but alone. Looks like my break is over. This is definitely going to be a problem later, he thought dourly before returning to the manor. What's going on, Nick? Sirius asked, concerned about the commotion that had been heard throughout the island. There was an intruder on the island that proved unusually powerful. I am sorry to say, but this trip is going to need to be cut short for everyone. I need to increase the island's security, Nick said, in no mood to sugar-coat it. Was it really that bad, boss? Lucas asked in disbelief. The person hinted at having been part of a group before he escaped, and he was far too powerful to be part of some normal organization. Also, I think he might be related to me somehow, Nick said seriously. 421. Chapter 421. What? Everyone exclaimed after Nick spoke. The man kept referring to me as nephew like he was actually related to me. Whatever the case, he was clearly not here with good intentions, and I have a feeling it wasn't his idea, Nick said seriously. After that, Nick had Darty return each person to their homes while he focused his attention to beefing up the wards around the island. Magic woven by Rowena Ravenclaw was powerful, sure, but it had a few weaknesses, and Nick could no longer ignore them after what just happened. The first thing he did was completely remove the wards for the first time in over 1,000 years so he could rebuild them entirely. Of course, he waited until he was finished designing the new wards before he did so, but it happened either way. He had Seram and Nazgul on high alert as he remade the wards around the island, but thankfully, he wasn't ambushed. The new wards worked similarly to the previous ones, except it was now a multi-layered, continuously shifting spatial solidification-style ward scheme. It took Nick 3 whole days to finish setting it up after the 3 weeks it took to design it. It was so detailed that nothing was capable of getting into or out of it save air, water, and mana without permission from Nick. The wards blocked every possible way in while also making it nearly impossible to even locate. 2 days after the new wards were installed, Nick found someone trying to break into the island again while under the same mana isolation invisibility as before. He allowed them entry from the manor and trapped them within the island. "You may as well reveal yourself since you are trapped in here." Nick spoke calmly to the invisible person. "You replaced the wards, I see. What a pain." The same man as before said as he stepped out into view. This time, however, his left eye was dull and clearly sightless, and his right arm was missing. "There is no escape for you this time, so why don't you explain who you are and why you are after me, and I'll allow you to die painlessly," Nick offered calmly. He had several powerful enchantments set on iron coins, capable of killing even the likes of Dumbledore from sheer destructive power alone, just for this meeting. "So you don't remember anything after all, and here I was thinking you took your exile personally." "We all did, to be honest. Not that we could blame you since that was some seriously cold-blooded shit we did to you. Either way, I suppose, it doesn't matter since it's come to this point. I won't tell you who we are, but I can say that you drew far too much attention to yourself, and us by extension, so you needed to be removed from the picture before you became too powerful to handle. Joke's on us, it looks like," the man said before coughing up blood. Nick was startled by this and raised his wand defensively. "Ah, well, I guess the jig is up. I didn't come here with any intention of escaping. After all, I don't have long left after the injuries you dealt me previously. Honestly, you wouldn't believe how pissed off that old bastard looked to learn you had both spirit magic and a beast that breathed purgatory flames of all things. It was almost worth the pain. Don't even bother trying to use legilimency this time, kid. They already took everything you might have wanted to know out and stuffed me full of false memories," the man said with a chuckle after seeing the irritation on Nick's face. "If you know you aren't leaving this island alive, and you have no use to me, why did you come here?" Nick asked, confused. "I am a messenger, kid. The message is real simple, too. Stop drawing so much attention to yourself, and we won't come after you again. The original plan was to just eliminate you, but that would cost us more than it's worth, so this was the least preferred plan that we had," the man said with a shrug as he leaned against a tree to rest. "Am I supposed to be grateful or something?" Nick asked sarcastically. "Ha! You sound just like your mother did before that old bastard killed her. Nah, kid, they don't give two shits what you feel about it, only that you do what they want. A piece of advice before I kick it in a moment, kid. Leave it alone and keep your head down because you don't want them to get serious in hunting you," the man said before starting to crumple into ash before Nick's eyes with a one final sigh as he vanished. 422. Chapter 422. Seems they were quite thorough, as there is nothing left for me to analyze. Unfortunately, it would also appear that things are much more complicated than I thought. Gods, why did it have to be a shadow organization of all things? It's like I need to deal with the Illuminati now. Okay, let me categorize what I learned from that whole conversation about the group. First is that the original owner of this body was a part of them, or at least used to be, and had relatives there. Second is that they have magics that I have never even heard of before now, and likely many people with bloodline abilities as well. Third is that my high-profile actions are drawing attention to them, and like every shadowy organization, they really don't like that. Fourth is that even with what I have shown, they are still confident in killing me, which is concerning to say the least. And at the top of this list of facts is that I don't have a bloody clue where to even start looking to find this group. Nick contemplated the situation and did not like the conclusion he came to, that he should do what they wanted for now at least. What a pain! Nick complained with a sigh before going back to the manor to redouble his training, as he didn't like the idea of being under another's thumb. The first thing he did, though, was to use the ruby he got from Vlad to create a greater flame Atronak. Unlike the normal ones that were about the same size, as a person, a greater flame Atronak was nearly 8 feet tall and had much more burnt metal parts on it. Once the greater Atronak was born, Nick wasted no time at all infusing a purgatory flame seed into it. This caused the appearance of the Atronak to shift as he condensed down to normal size for an Atronak, but grew 2 crystalline flame wing from its back and turned a silver color to match the purgatory flames themselves. The terrifying thing, though, was that to Nick's senses, it contained the same level of mana as Dumbledore did, which meant it was his first Atronak to reach the 4th tier of power. Why does it look like an angel made of fire? He wondered, confused at the form the construct took after getting the flame seed introduced to it. There was no books on why Atronachs took certain forms, which probably meant nobody actually cared enough to figure it out, or they simply couldn't. A skilled mage could manually change an Atronach's shape, but in most cases, the original form of the Atronach was the best for combat. Still, after created that Atronach, Nick had to hold off on making any more for a while, since the mana levels on the island dropped sharply from its birth. There was some good news, however, in the form of the Animagus ritual finally having been finished being modified. The changes to the ritual were fairly small, all things considered, as Nick merely needed to add the magical creature birth phenomena to it. So the final ritual was as follows. First, under the light of an unobstructed full moon, place a mandrake leaf in your mouth. The leaf must then stay in your mouth until the next unobscured full moon. Second, was to find or create a small vial that had received the pure rays of the moon. Once the month with the leaf was over, place it into the vial alongside one of your hairs and a silver teaspoon of dew from a place no human feet or sunlight has touched. Then you add the chrysalis of a death's head hawk moth to the mixture and then store the vial in a quiet, dark place until the next electrical storm came around. Finally, every day at sunrise and sunset, one must point their wands at their heart and recite the words Amato Animo Animato Animagus, which is the normal process, but Nick's version had an extra step that needed to be done when the sun was at its highest point. This step involved pointing one's wand at their heart and saying Natura Magici Benedictionis 7 times. If these steps are followed, then, when the electrical storm comes and you drink the mixture, you start the transformation process. The rest is merely remaining confident in yourself during the change and letting the magic run its course. Luckily for Nick, he had prepared all the ingredients long ago, and he thankfully didn't need to change any of them, but merely wait for the next unobstructed full moon. 423. Chapter 423. This might not seem like a huge difference considering how long he spent deducing it, but it should be remembered that this magic was very complicated, and making even small changes could have massive side effects. The difficulty was finding the exact changes that didn't bring any of those into play while still giving the benefits he wanted. The next full moon is in a week, and if the conditions are correct, I can start this process then, he thought eagerly. With that matter pretty much settled, Nick turned his attention to improving his power. He first spent a week to master all of the 7th year's material while placing the mandrake leaf to the roof of his mouth with the sticking charm under the full moon. After that, he polished his spell-casting ability in the dueling room until he got a perfect score in the 7th slot. His own actual proficiency in dueling was slightly higher than in the room, since his magical senses didn't work on the illusion's attacks, since it was all just the same illusion to them. After that, he began to look into spell cloaking, like what that man did that made it impossible for Nick's senses to see. Nick didn't even think it was possible, but he had personally witnessed it, so he now knew about it and wanted it for himself. How could he not when, if added to the island's wards, would hide the island even better, maybe even to the point his magical senses also couldn't find it? The problem, however, was that he had no idea where to even begin in his research into magical cloaking. You would think focusing on something like the invisibility spell or notice me not spell would be a good start, but you would be wrong. This was because just like all the usual spells he had come across, he could see them plain as day, which meant that they clearly wouldn't work. Nick checked the system for a book on the subject, and while there was a few, they were almost all horribly expensive point-wise. The cheapest was a book titled The Vaguities of Vagueness by Arne Skalf, at a stinging 500,000 points. Nick refused to pay that when he was only 200,000 away from the book that will basically make him truly immortal, or at the very least stupid hard to kill. Still, at least I can confirm that the subject is way out of my league for the moment and move on to other easier things, he thought with a sigh. With that pathway, a bust Nick chose to focus his attention on his true field of expertise, crafting. Despite how it may seem, Nick wouldn't be nearly as dangerous or advanced as he is currently if it wasn't for his crafting ability, and he never forgot it. Sure, his bloodline abilities alone made him prodigious at learning magic, but only a few steps better than other prodigies like Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and Voldemort. No, all the miracle feats of magic he has performed were all thanks to his crafting, and that is why above all else he identifies as the Ringmaker. Nick knew that the key to his future lied with his crafts just as his foundation rested upon it. So he turned his attention to his Twilight-style crafting ability to improve and find exactly what he needed to master it. It was a slow and monotonous process that he dragged Lucas into as his assistant. Wake up, eat, draw in light, meditate to recover, experiment with the light, eat, sleep, repeat. This was Nick's daily routine for the next week before the school shopping list for the third year came into his post box. Nick looked it over for a moment before discarding it, since he already had all the books listed. Unlike last year, Nick will be attending a few classes this year, however. That was because he wanted to rather than it being mandatory like with everyone else. He had specifically chosen to take arithmancy, divination, and standard enchanting to patch up his less than orthodox understanding of the subjects. Despite this, he could drop the classes at any point should he so wish without any repercussions. This continued freedom had been Dumbledore's gift to Nick as a way to express thanks for ending Voldemort's threat, as well as helping to prepare for the future. The old goat had, of course, made sure that Nick hadn't needed the actual classes before he did this, but the idea remained the same. That reminds me for whatever reason, but since I have already invalidated the events of the third year from the books, what will happen now? Nick pondered curiously. 424. Chapter 424. It was a reasonable question, to be sure, as knowing the future roughly was had allowed Nick to make such great progress in various important matters, such as dealing with Voldemort's Horcruxes. But with the events of the books being pretty much invalidated entirely at this point, he had no clue what was coming, and it made him a bit nervous. Not much, since he was pretty well prepared for just about any normal wizarding issue, but a little none the less. I guess I'll do like normal and deal with the problems as they come, he decided eventually. Nick finally got the first shipment of alchemically treated mirrors from Leo LeBlanc and sent over a jar filled with fire salts to the man as payment. This shipment was only consistent of a dozen mirror that looked fairly normal, as they had silver handles and backs that were smooth and plain, while the glass was hard and clean. Nick was quite happy with them, all things considered, and went to enchanting them in the way he wanted. He had already used Jesseph to inform Vlad of the delay on the mirrors, so there was no problem on that end. And done, Nick said, after he finished enchanting all of the mirrors in the manner he wanted. Each of the mirrors going to the royals had a standard protean charm and connection to the master mirror. That he was going to keep that had the modified version of the protean charm and connection on it. This meant the royals could send and receive messages to Nick, but not to each other, while he could contact anyone he wanted. Darty, he called, and the elf appeared. Give these 11 mirrors to Jesseph, and tell him that they will serve as the method of communication between us, he said, and the elf bowed and did as ordered. 3 days until I head back to Hogwarts officially, so I should finish up what I have here and relax until then, he thought, and looked over at the dangerous object he had created while experimenting with the elemental salts, the Omni Crystal. The Omni Crystal was an accidental creation that happened when Nick accidentally spilt some fire salts into some air salts, and created a furnace, crystal, that created an unbearably hot temperature around it, like standing within a furnace, hence the name. The Omni crystal came as a result of the spark of inspiration Nick got from that when he mixed air salts and the other two Atronac salts. He had to create powerful magic crystals before he collided all the crystals together. The resulting product was the Omni crystal that, surprisingly enough, had no attribute of its own, but took and enhanced the properties of whatever it was exposed to. The problem was, however, that it did exactly that. You know, those trace amounts of elements in the air. Yeah, Nick learned firsthand that more is not always better after spikes of diamond and super flammable gas filled the workshop. Nick was forced to contain the Omni crystal in a special container that kept it suspended in a vacuum, isolated from literally everything. Despite this, though, Nick was very excited about the crystal, as he imagined that it could serve in some rather insane alchemical creations, like the philosopher's stone-level insanity. After that brief accident, he stopped keeping the salts near each other and got very careful when handling them. 3 days later, and it was finally time to head back to Hogwarts, so Nick had Dottie transport him to the castle. "Good afternoon, Hagrid." Nick greeted the groundskeeper after he arrived long before any other student. "Blimey, Nick, what are you doing here so early?" Hagrid asked, surprised to see him. "I used my house elf to apparate to the castle, figured I'd come say hello while I wait for the rest to get here," Nick said honestly. Hagrid nodded. "Dead useful them elves are. Can't imagine what we'd do without them," he said honestly, and Nick agreed with him. "So what have you been up to over the summer, Nick?" Hagrid asked curiously. "Made friends with the Royal Vampire Clan, discovered a secret organization that isn't my biggest fan, and made several breakthroughs in my studies." Nick thought to himself, while what he actually said was, "More of the same, I'm afraid. Work, study, and even more work after that. Been real busy, you see." Nick spoke honestly and shrugged helplessly. "Aye, life'll do that to you sometimes, but it always works itself out in the end. Just you wait," Hagrid said assuringly. "I'll keep that in mind, but I'll see you later, since for now I'd like to have a chat with Dumbledore over something I learned during the summer," Nick said before leaving. 425. Chapter 425. Nick was in no rush as he walked the halls of the castle while heading to the headmaster's office, and spotted the small flaws in the school's magic from 1,000 years of degradation and magical damage. He wouldn't have noticed them had it not been for his memorization of Rowena Ravenclaw's wards on the island before he took them down to be replaced with his improved ones. "I suppose I will be nice enough to repair the damage to the castle's enchantments while I am here," Nick thought offhandedly as he reached the gargoyle leading to Dumbledore. "Move aside. I need to speak to the headmaster." He spoke calmly but firmly, and the gargoyle statue rotated out of the way. This was a shortcut that past headmasters had added to the statue in order to make sure that students were never turned away if they had a need to speak with them. The trick was the intent by which you spoke to the statue, as if you weren't serious, you required a password. "Ah, good evening, Nicholas. To what do I owe your visit this time?" the old man asked in a friendly but polite manner. "Over the summer, a man claiming to be my uncle trespassed upon my island with the intent to kill me under the orders of a shadow organization of some sort. I was hoping you may be able to illuminate who they might be, and if I should do as they wish and keep my head down or not." Nick spoke calmly and straight to the point. Dumbledore lost his smile and turned serious instantly after hearing what Nick said. "Can you describe anything about this group that you may have gleaned from your encounter with this uncle of yours?" the old man asked sternly, and Nick gave every detail he could. "Um, I can think of 4 possibilities, with none being good for you. The first is the Order of the Golden Sands, that is a secretive group, known only to those with true power in the world like myself and Nico. They were originally a collective of tomb raiders that hoard ancient powerful knowledge taken from ancient wizards' tombs. Terribly secretive and merciless due to their origins, they have been moving behind the scenes for many years, collecting unique bloodline abilities and knowledge, whatever the means necessary. The second is the Dragon's Claw, but it is unlikely since they are a group based in Japan and have little interest in Western magic. The third is a group in Venezuela known as the Followers of Zeus, but they would be more likely to try and recruit you than kill you since your ability is a good fit. I won't even talk about a final group since I know for certain that they would leave you alone. Dumbledore said calmly. Why is that? Nick asked, confused about why he was so sure. That is the acolytes created by Gellert so long ago. He has clearly chosen to leave you alone, so they will follow his example. Dumbledore explained honestly. From the sound of it, you seem fairly certain that it is the Order of the Golden Sands behind this attack and ultimatum. Why? Nick asked seriously. You said that the one who came to the island used several forms of magic that were completely unknown to you but powerful. That is the telltale sign of ancient lost magics at work. Things like that don't simply come from nowhere, as you are aware, after having founded two crafting styles yourself. In majority of cases, the reappearance of such magic is from ancient tombs that had been raided and integrated. The old goat said sternly. That would make sense if they were tomb raiders like you said. But why would they exile me and then try to kill me after I started to make a name for myself? Nick asked, confused. Perhaps someone you have offended recognized one of the group's members as similar to you and has been causing them problems. Dumbledore offered helpfully. How on earth does that warrant execution, though? Like being told to compensate them, I can understand, but going straight to death is a bit much, no? Nick asked, confused. Perhaps if you weren't related to them in some way, but you said that they exiled you, which means they may be fearful of you attacking them for revenge if you continue to grow at your current rate. Dumbledore pointed out seriously. I literally don't remember a thing about them, though. In fact, I am fairly certain they erased my memory before they exiled me, which explains why I have no memories from before that alley. Nick said, frustrated at the absurdity of the situation. 426. Chapter 426. A reasonable assumption given the information you have available, but I am rather curious as to why you were exiled to begin with, Dumbledore said with a confused look. I have no idea, to be honest with you, but more importantly, should I do what they want and just keep my head down? Nick asked seriously. He didn't like it, but in this case, the old goat's advice on this matter will probably be the correct course of action. In a normal time, my answer might be different, but considering the circumstances of the world today, it would be for the best to do as they wish, at least temporarily. Dumbledore said seriously. Nick sighed. I thought so, but was hoping you might say otherwise. He said honestly, the Order of the Golden Sands is not a group to be trifled with even by people like myself. While your growth is astonishing and your enchantments extraordinary, you are not at the level where you can handle them yet. The old man said softly, Fine, I'll play by their rules for now, but I will eventually kick their teeth down their throats. Nick said with a huff before leaving the office. I don't doubt it. Dumbledore muttered with a tired sigh and turning his attention back to the paperwork on his desk. Nick was surprised that he hadn't lost his temper with everything that had been going on and was still actually fairly calm. That is because of your soul finally stabilizing from your reckless expansion of it previously. Celebrimbor said from within the mindscape. What do you mean? Nick thought, confused. The elf pretty much lived in Nick's head and had gotten good at hearing his thoughts as a result, so Nick wasn't surprised about it, considering the elf was actually fairly wise. Getting advice from a several thousand-year-old elf in exchange for a little less privacy was a bargain no matter the situation. Besides, it wasn't possible for Celebrimbor to try and betray Nick, considering he was bound to the system and was only allowed away from it with good behavior. It may seem a bit cruel, but the elf had agreed to this when he chose to take the system's offer. The soul is deeply tied to your very essence, so when you expanded it like you did, your emotions were destabilized and heightened. Celebrimbor spoke calmly. So all those outbursts were just because of my soul being unstable. Nick questioned unhappily. Not entirely, but for the most part, yes. The elf said with clear amusement. Why didn't you say anything before now? Nick asked, and the response he got was mildly infuriating to say the least. You wouldn't have learnt anything if I had. The elf said smugly. Nick groaned, but understood what Celebrimbor meant. This was one of those lessons that was mostly harmless to learn, but embarrassing to an unbelievable degree. It was like learning how to dance and stepping on your partner's feet. Embarrassing, yes, but ultimately harmless. Still, with the conversation with Dumbledore out of the way, Nick didn't have any other plans besides grabbing everyone's favorite Niffler from McGonagall. Steve may as well be a mascot for Hogwarts, so Nick agreed to allow McGonagall to take care of him when Nick wasn't in the castle. The small thief was perfectly okay with that too, since McGonagall was a big softy despite how stern she seemed. If he hasn't gained weight, I'll owe Ron a galleon. Nick thought with a chuckle as he knocked on the door to McGonagall's office. Come in. Her voice spoke from the other side with clear confusion. She couldn't really be blamed, since she was definitely not expecting any visitors. Nick pushed open the wooden door and smirked when he saw the surprise on her face at his appearance. Should you not be on the train at this moment, Mr. Ravenclaw? She asked, confused. I had my house elf deliver me to Hogwarts instead. Nick said honestly. She nodded in understanding. Very well, what is it you need? She asked calmly. Just came to grab the little troublemaker is all. Nick said with a grin before spotting his target snoozing on a pile of suspiciously familiar silver ingots. Steve had gotten fat over the last 3 months, as he almost resembled a ball with how round he was. Nick just shook his head at this and took out a galleon and dropped it on the stone floor. Ting! The coin bounced, and the Niffler stirred fro its slumber. What have you even been feeding him for him to get so out of shape? Nick couldn't help but ask, and the elderly witch looked embarrassed. I suppose the better question would be, what hasn't he eaten? Instead. The elves are particularly fond of testing new recipes on him, and he seemed content with it, so I may have allowed an unhealthy amount of gluttony. McGonagall said, embarrassed. 427. Chapter 427. Nick collected the obese Niffler and the ingots that had been stolen from the workshop and bid the professor goodbye. Steve was quite unhappy at being tricked awake and then having his hard stolen loot confiscated, but Nick was having none of it and silenced him with a spell. He calmed down, though, when he was dropped unceremoniously on his hoard in the workshop by Nick. After that, Nick cranked out a few rings of protection as he waited for the rest of the students to start arriving. It's funny how I used to consider this challenging, he thought as he expertly wove the enchantment into the rings with each swing of his hammer. Right before the sun started to go down, Nick finished up and put on his school robes before heading to the Great Hall. He was the first one there, of course, and took a seat at the Gryffindor table leisurely while he waited for the rest of the students to arrive. The looks he got as they started to file into the room were priceless, as you could see the confusion on their faces. Where were you? Ron asked when he sat down at the table across from Nick. I had my house elf bring me to Hogwarts rather than take the train, so I have been here all day. Nick explained calmly. You can do that? Ron exclaimed in disbelief. Nick scoffed. Of course you can. Most people don't, out of some sort of sense of tradition, though. Besides, the train was originally intended to be used by the Muggle-born students who didn't have easy access to the Flu network since their parents were Muggles. He said honestly. I had always wondered about that, but I suppose it makes sense with how sensitive everyone is about the statute of secrecy. Hermione said calmly. Oh yeah, but whatever happened with that fellow that broke into your island during our visit? Harry asked curiously. He won't be a problem anymore. Sorry about cutting the trip short like that, but I was rather bothered that someone could just slip into the island like that. Nick said honestly. It's fine. Sirius said that learning you weren't as safe as you thought leaves a bad feeling in your guts. Harry said with a smile. I suppose he would know from experience after all. Nick nodded as he said this. Did you ever figure out if he was actually your uncle or not? Ron asked curiously. He probably was. It doesn't matter, though they abandoned me, so I have nothing but spite for them. Nick said honestly. He wasn't going to explain about the order to them, since it would not benefit them at all, and might even be detrimental. Still, he could make it clear that he didn't want to talk about the subject anymore. Soon enough, though, it was time for the sorting ceremony to begin, and the hall got quiet to listen to the hats sing and sort. The song was all right like usual, but the sorting was the really interesting part, as there was always a betting pool about which house would get the most new students. Usually, it was a close match between Gryffindor and Hufflepuff, so the other two houses rarely bet on themselves. Nick noticed Daphne's sister in the gaggle of little first years and paid attention to the curse actively working against her body. It was an interesting curse, to be honest, as despite Daphne having hints of it within herself, they were dormant and suppressed by her magic, while the same curse was feeding off of Astoria's magic. The really weird part was that the curse was not inherently malicious by itself, from what he could tell. The easiest way to describe it for him was that it was like faulty software that failed to perform as it was intended to. It's almost like the curse was supposed to do something else, but I can't quite figure out what. Nick thought with a frown. Obviously, whoever cast the curse on the Greengrass bloodline did so with malicious intent, but the inventor of the curse was clearly after something else with it, and Nick wanted to know what. There was one other first-year student, however, that made Nick narrow his eyes after noticing. To be more specific, it was the difference in their magic from everyone else that he noticed. In a way, it was uncomfortably similar to Lucas's, as it was split between their core and blood. Strangely, though the student wasn't a vampire or anything like that, as the magical signature of the condition was absent. Jonathan Burnham was the boy's name according to the list McGonagall was reading off of, which meant that the boy was either a muggle-born or had magical parents, and didn't know it if the sheer wonder at everything around him was any indication. 428. Chapter 428. The boy was sorted into Ravenclaw eventually, and Nick decided to ask Flitwick and Luna to keep an eye on him to see if his strangeness manifests in a noticeable manner. Nick wasn't worried about the boy being the next Dark Lord or anything like that, but he was rather curious about why his magic was split in this manner. In Lucas's case, it was Nick's doing so that he could regain his magical casting ability, but the boy was entirely different. His magic was clearly split from birth with how unburdened his mana core seemed to be. Lucas's mana core, by comparison, was far more stressed to maintain a steady flow of mana to both his blood and magical circuits. Still, Nick stopped paying attention to the boy after he was sorted and checked to see if there were any more strange new students, but there were none. Astoria ended up sorted into Slytherin much like her sister, and Dumbledore started the year off with a rousing speech, but no ominous warning, which was new. The twins snickered to themselves when Dumbledore mentioned the list of forbidden items that Filch created and was nailed to his door. Nick knew from checking the previous year's list out of curiosity that most of said list is comprised of the twins' prank items. This meant that since they never really stopped creating new prank items, that the list just got longer and longer every year. The feast started after Dumbledore's speech, and everyone dug into the sumptuous food. Starting the year off strong, eh, fellas? Nick asked the twins after seeing a first year literally turn orange after drinking from their goblet. You know it, Fred said with a grin. Want to set a record this year? George added, equally grinning. Good luck with that. Speaking of luck, was that Griffcat you took from my island at? Nick asked curiously. Both of the twins turned to stare at the professor's table, specifically towards the end of it. Nick looked and chuckled at what he saw there. Hagrid was grinning ear to ear as he passed sausages to the unkempt-looking creature poking its head out from under his coat. Well, at least you know it's in good hands, since I don't think that man can knowingly mistreat a magical beast. Nick said with a grin, and the twins merely sighed together. Aye, Mum said that he needs to stay with Hagrid while we are at Hogwarts, or she would send it back to your island. That reminds us, by the way, but why was Garfield ill for a bit after we brought him out of your island? George asked curiously. No idea, maybe it was something in the air, Nick suggested with a shrug. Explaining mana and its ambient density in a public place like this was a very bad idea, and Nick tried not to indulge in those. The twins didn't look convinced, but chose to drop the matter since it wasn't really all that important. After the feast, everyone went to their common rooms, with the prefects being in charge of showing the first years to it. Percy, being the try-hard, he took his role very seriously as the head boy of Gryffindor and strictly forced the prefects to remain professional during this time. Nick couldn't really blame him, considering this was his final year at Hogwarts, and he wanted to graduate with honors and join the Ministry of Magic. It's going to suck to be him in a few years when Grindelwald sets off his plan, and he is the grunt assigned the inevitable mountains of paperwork. Nick thought with a chuckle. The rest of the night was nice and uneventful, and Nick went straight to sleep, as he had a big week ahead of him, as he had his first class for all three of the electives he signed up for. The next day was like every year the one that allowed the first years to explore the castle, to get familiar with it before classes on Monday. Nick chose to spend this day relaxing in the workshop with his friends as they spoke of their summers. To their surprise, the mirror he kept in his coat warmed up, which was a sign of a change being made via the protean connection. "What's up with the mirror?" Ron asked curiously when Nick took it out. "It's a communication device for my agreement with the royal clan of the vampires," Nick said while flipping through the connections of the mirror till he found the one that sent it. The face of the mirror had an etched message on it when he did so that read, "Greetings, Nick. It is Vladimir who is testing the mirror you have sent. Please send a reply." 429. Chapter 429. Nick read the message and repaired the damage left on the mirror from the message before pulling out a quill. No need to carve the words onto the mirror. Ink will suffice. He wrote before watching the ink vanish from the mirror's face with a smirk. The reason he needed the bonded enchantment from the vanishing cabinets was so the mirrors could send fluids through to the other side in small concentrations. It was basically the same as sending a letter, but nearly instantaneous, while totally ignoring the issues an owl may have doing so. "Did you just send a message through a mirror?" Tracy asked in shock. "I did, and it's already reached the other mirror connected to it as well," Nick said smugly. "Do you even realize the significance of what you have done? If every wizard had access to something like this, then it would render Owlmill obsolete," she exclaimed excitedly. "I am aware of that, but do you have any idea how expensive a single mirror would actually be just to make?" Nick asked calmly. "Isn't it just a normal silver mirror that has been enchanted?" Hermione asked, confused. Nick shook his head. "This mirror and those connected to it are all alchemically treated before given a very specific enchantment that allows them to function. I estimate that it costs nearly 60 galleons just to create this single mirror, so if I sold them then, it would be at around 70 galleons to make it worth mass producing. How many people do you think could easily afford such a price?" He explained seriously with a rhetorical question at the end. "What if you didn't alchemically treat the mirrors, but just enchanted them?" Luna asked curiously. "Well then, the cost to make one would be around 15 galleons, but the treatment is very important for the longevity of the mirrors, because as you know they aren't the most durable of things, and once cracked or broken, are nearly impossible to fix without magic. Due to the nature of the enchantment, however, if one mirror breaks at least some of that damage, will transfer to every mirror it was connected to, which will mean all those people would need to pay to either repair or repurchase a new mirror. I have long considered selling something like this, but the price to do so makes it difficult," Nick explained with a sigh. He is well aware of how mirrors like this could revolutionize the magical communications industry, but the price point for the mass production of them was simply too high. He of course was searching for a cheaper way to construct the things, but so far this was it. Why not just change the materials that make up the mirror to something stronger? Harry asked, confused, since it seemed like a common-sense solution. "How many of you signed up for the enchanting elective?" Nick asked, and Hermione, Tracy, and Daphne raised their hands. "Whoever is going to be teaching that class should also explain this, but listen up. Materials each have their own conductivity to magic, with some being great for it, and others being terrible at it. Things with high magical conductivity tend to also be rather expensive, so changing the material of the mirrors to a sturdier material with the necessary conductivity to hold the enchantment would equally raise the price considerably as well. Alchemically treated glass and silver is the cheapest materials possible with the necessary conductivity," Nick explained patiently. "So no chance for these to get mass-produced for cheap then?" Daphne asked, while looking a little depressed at the lost opportunity. "Not necessarily. See, while I haven't found a cheaper way to create these mirrors, that does not mean that one does not exist. The problem is finding it," Nick said honestly. "If it helps, these mirrors are actually the crudest possible use of this enchantment line. With some serious tweaking to the enchantment, it is theoretically possible to record images, sounds, and even send and receive items freely," Nick said, and everyone looked dumbfounded by the sheer concept of such a thing. At this moment, the mirror grew warm again, and some ink in the form of a message appeared on the surface of the mirror. What a marvelous enchantment! I will keep this mirror for my personal use, but will pass the rest to my most loyal clan members until more arrive. It read, and Nick banished the ink from the mirror and put it away again. The rest of the afternoon until lunch was spent with them, just relaxing and swapping ideas. Luna's were usually the most difficult to pull off realistically, but for a few of them, she gave Nick hopeful looks when she mentioned them. 430. Chapter 430. Specifically, the idea of magical teleporting letters that always reach their target, regardless of distance. In theory, it was a cheaper but effective way to deliver messages. However, it was not very easy at all to pull off. Contrary to how it seems, and how most wizards saw it, teleportation had a lot of details that needed to be kept in mind to integrate properly. The most common form of travel for wizards in the form of apparition was not even teleportation, as despite its minute time frame, it did actually have one from departure to arrival. This was because apparition worked based on the concept of spatial tunneling that involved creating a small tube of magic that flung the wizard from one spot to another based on the coordinates they set. Normally, this process would take a period of time to make calculations, but thanks to the nature of magic, that wasn't necessary so long as the rules of apparition were followed. Sea magic as a whole had this funny property of remembering spells, so that the next time they are used, even if it is by a complete idiot, they only need the words and wand movements to succeed if there is no intent in the spell. In the case of apparition, it was just the word apparate, and firmly picturing one's destination to succeed. Compared to what the inventor of the spell had to go through, it was like creating a nuclear bomb from theory and pressing a button to set one off, incomparable. It was simply not worth the effort to redefine the wheel in Nick's opinion. He was fine with innovation if it made sense, but he had absolutely no reason to create a spell like the one Luna suggested. The next day arrived, and it was time for Nick to get his first experience with divination. The classroom for the subject was held at the top of the north tower of the school, since it was apparently a fortunate location. The entrance to the classroom was little more than a hatch with a knob to be pulled down. The classroom itself was an odd mix between an attic and an old-fashioned tea shop with 24 chairs and even less tables, while the lamps and windows were shaded by red cloth, and the fireplace had a kettle releasing copious amounts of fumes into the air. To Nick's surprise, the incense being burnt in the kettle was highly magical in nature, as though it would be more accurate to consider it an aerosolized potion than regular incense. Bloody hell, it's warm in here. Ron complained, and Harry looked to agree. Where is the teacher at anyways? The redhead asked, confused. Over there under a notice me not charm. Nick said casually, pointing out the teacher. How perceptive of you, young one. A female voice speaks up from that location as the professor steps into view. Welcome, children. How wonderful to meet you all in the material world, Trelawney said to the students. The woman had long, disheveled, dirty blonde hair and large, round glasses that made her eyes look much bigger than they were. The most interesting thing Nick found about her, however, was that she had an obsessive amount of decorative object on her, from chains to bangles and rings. The interesting part was that nearly half of these objects were actually magical, though the sort of magic on them was confusing to say the least. Every single one of these magical objects were focused on probability magic or luck magic for the less aware. Luck magic was one of the few fields that Nick avoided, like it was cancerous specifically, because of the horrible outcomes it tended to have. Trelawney, however, used the enchantments to an interesting effect, as the magic was split equally between positive and negative outcomes. In other words, she had forcefully caused her luck to stay on a neutral level. This sounded pointless, but for a seer this neutrality was likely very much necessary, or they would go mad from the sheer amount of visions they would see. Not even visions of important events either, but rather the outcomes of small things with no bearing on anything. If they did have a vision of something important, however, no one would know unless it was horribly obvious as a result. So you have chosen to study divination, the most difficult of all magical arts. I must warn for on the onset that if you do not have the sight, there is very little I will be able to teach you. Books can only take you so far in this field, Trelawney said seriously. Hermione scoffed to herself at that, but Nick knew that the professor wasn't making this up, and that Hermione was going to find it out the hard way. 431. Chapter 431. The professor then went on to make a bunch of predictions that sounded ominous, but were so vague that they should have been ignored. Those were foolishly heeded by nearly everyone, though which left most of the class nervous what else she would predict. For the first quarter, we shall focus our energies on tea reading before switching to the crystal ball in the second term. Unfortunately, there will be an outbreak of the flu in February to disrupt our class, and I shall lose my voice before one of our number shall leave us forever near Easter. Trelawney spoke sternly. After that, she personally went to each student in the class and made a prediction about their future. When she finally made it to Nick, the entire class was curious as to what she would say about him. The woman looked at Nick with true seriousness when she got to him and shuddered in horror and sadness. You have such suffering to come, and before it ends, you will lose something that you hold most dear, she said apologetically. I am not the only one to suffer through what is to come, Nick said ominously, and Trelawney's eyes widened before she nodded in agreement. The class proceeded like a fairly normal class after that, as they needed to learn to brew tea leaves and determine what the shapes meant. Nick was a bit disappointed at this, but didn't pull out of the class over it, since he was aware that her predictions always came true. What did you mean earlier? Harry asked curiously as they left the classroom. Most of the class eavesdropped in hopes of hearing the answer to the question, but were greatly disappointed. It does not matter at the moment, Nick said before separating from his friends to head to the workshop. Nick was quite worried about the last part of Trelawney's prediction, as there is a number of things he holds quite dear to his heart, and losing any of them would take a heavy toll on his emotions and mind. He sighed. There's no point in agonizing over it until it happens. What will come will come, he thought before getting started on making some rings of protection to draw his mind away from it. Nick wanted to bind himself formally to the realm so that he could take the first step towards his ultimate goal, but before that he needed the other 200,000 points to purchase the book from the system. Nick finished his work and spent the rest of the day studying in the Chamber of Secrets by reading Slytherin's life story. The man started life as part of the nobility in the Isles at the time as the third son of a knight. He was surprisingly Muggle-born in truth, as his family was comprised entirely of Muggles minus his great-grandfather, who was a wizard. His family was less than accepting of his status, however, and it was only because of another wizard that he wasn't killed. This wizard was a wandering druid who discovered Slytherin's Parseltongue, and thus saved him from his family to have him take up his mantle. The language was not reviled at the time, except seen as the gift it was, and so the druid knew that Slytherin was talented. Slytherin's first wand was made of oak, with a core made out of the horns of a rare horned water serpent. The founder showed great potential and soaked up everything the druid had to teach before eventually separating from his master at the age of 16 to make a name for himself. Slytherin had an insatiable thirst for knowledge and grandeur and traveled all around the world in search of both. It was during these travels that he met the other founders as they worked together to face powerful dark wizards and dangerous tombs. The man detailed each magic he learned as well as the improvements he made to them in his books that Nick devoured hungrily. He may not have ended all that well, but he deserved respect nonetheless, Nick thought with a sigh after he closed the book he just finished. It was dinner time, and Nick didn't want to miss it, so he left the chamber for now and went to the great hall. After eating and chatting with his friends, Nick went to bed so that he could be well rested for his first day of enchanting tomorrow. He didn't have any high hopes for the class, though as without prior knowledge of runes, the professor couldn't really get into the interesting stuff immediately. In fact, Nick was pretty sure the class would end up with the basic principles being explained and the materials being taught. 432. Chapter 432. Still, when the time came for him to go to the class, Nick did so without any complaint. The enchanting class was one of the new ones that had been implemented after Flamel injected funds into the school. While many of the upperclassmen were skeptical about the class, since it seemed to heavily clash with the Ancient Runes class in terms of subject matter, but the truth was much different. Enchanting taught the fundamentals of the craft, while Ancient Runes barely scraped the surface of how the runes could be used. Sure, enchanting was covered in the class, but it was a sort of one-and-done type thing. Obviously, the art of enchanting was far more complicated than that, and thus few people really got into the field after Hogwarts until now. Had this not been the case, and the enchanting class had existed for a long period of time, then the wizarding world would likely look very different. This was Nick's thoughts on the subject, and the professor of ancient runes, Professor Bathsheba Babbling, seemed agreed with them. Professor had been discouraging the idea that enchanting clashed with her class since the moment it was announced last year after all. Anyway, the room for the class was located in one of the previously empty classrooms on the 5th floor. The professor at least knows how to help students find their classroom. Nick thought with a chuckle as he saw the bright glowing enchanted sign over the door that read enchanting. It was a simple but effective enchantment that did its job without too much wasted mana. The runes used are also well written and linked in a clear and precise manner, so they definitely know what they were doing. Nick analyzed at a glance before walking into the room. The room had a similar design to that of the Transfiguration classroom, with several two-person tables, all facing the large table at the front. The biggest difference, however, was that on top of the large table were several samples of different materials and a small label for each of them. Mr. Ravenclaw, I'm honored that you chose to attend my class, given your well-known ability in the field of enchanting. A male voice said for Nick's right, and he looked over to its source. There, standing to the side of the doorway, was a short man with a thin build and short, messy brown hair and pale skin from clear lack of sunlight. I did not learn the field in a proper orthodox manner, and so decided to attend the class in order to patch this deficit in knowledge. Nick explained honestly. I see. Well, at least you are willing and able to admit and correct your own flaws. I can't say the same for most prodigies, the man said with a smile. The ones that I am aware of, at least. Nick said with a shrug. Seeing as the class is starting to fill up, you best find a seat before I begin, the professor said after a quick look around the classroom. Nick found a spot next to Hermione and waited for the class to begin officially. Once the seats were filled, the professor stood at the front of the class and began to speak up. Good afternoon, children. My name is Ernest Gremont, and I have the privilege of teaching the wondrously complex and fulfilling art of enchanting to each of you. A warning before that, however, is that if any of you have not taken ancient runes this year, as well, then you will find this class supremely difficult, as the most well-known type of enchanting requires knowledge of them. That said, it is not impossible to excel at this subject without having taken the class if you study the subject in your free time or already know of it to a great degree. Does anyone have any questions before we begin? Professor Gremont asked at the end of his introduction. From a nearby seat, Anthony Goldstein raised his hand. Yes, what is it? The professor asked encouragingly. Well, it's just that until now most of us only know of his enchantments. Is there a difference between the two? Anthony asked while pointing at Nick. An excellent question, 10 points to Ravenclaw. But to answer your inquiry, yes, there is several differences between the traditional enchantments and Mr. Ravenclaw's works. Though I cannot list all of them due to not having learnt his style of enchantment myself, since he created it and has not shared it with the rest of the world. Professor Gremont stated calmly. Susan Bones then raised her hand from a different table. The teacher motioned for her to speak, and she asked another good question. What differences can you tell us? 433. Chapter 433. Another excellent question. 10 points to Hufflepuff. Thankfully for you all, I came prepared for questions such as these, since I knew you all would not be able to help making comparisons to your famous schoolmates' works. The answer to your question, however, is actually one of the things that baffles the enchanters trying to replicate his method on their own. There is honestly very little similarities to the traditional enchanting method that his works have. For starters, his enchantments aren't engraved into the material, but infused throughout it, which makes it nearly impossible to study and thus replicate. Even further is that he seems to use an entirely new runic language that no one has been able to translate yet. I personally have found that his enchantments are also nearly 400% more efficient than the traditional ones, the professor said honestly. Looks like the normal enchanters are stuck at the surface level understanding of my style. Nick thought without any surprise at all. The style was on a fundamental level different than the traditional enchantments found in the wizarding community, so there is nothing close to even make comparisons on. With that knowledge, it becomes clear why little to no progress in understanding his style has been made. So does that mean his style is better? Michael Finnegan asked without raising his hand. Before the professor could say anything, though, Nick answered the question. Neither is better than the other, as both excel in different fields, he said calmly, and the professor nodded in agreement when the class looked at him to see his response to that. Like Mr. Ravenclaw said, both styles of enchanting have their own pros and cons, so neither is better than the other. An example of this is that if the enchanting community's theory is correct, his style demands a horrifying level of energy per enchantment, the professor said seriously. In comparison, the traditional style of enchanting takes a very small amount of energy, thus letting those using it create more things faster generally. He added, and Nick couldn't disagree with that, since while it was possible to create a large amount of enchanted objects at the same time with the Celebrimber style, it required a back-breaking amount of repetition to accomplish. Enough about his style of enchantment, though. My job is to teach you everything you need to know about traditional enchantments, and as your class is lucky enough to have Mr. Ravenclaw in it, you may even be able to glean an understanding of his own as well. To start you all off, however, is the least fun part of learning enchantment, material memorization. Now can anyone besides Mr. Ravenclaw tell me why this is important? The professor asked, and Tracy raised her hand eagerly. Go ahead, Miss Davis, he said, and she basically regurgitated Nick's previous mini-lesson on conductivity. That is correct, though I will not reward points for the answer, since it is clear you learned it from Mr. Ravenclaw, given the disappointed look he is giving you, the professor said, with a chuckle. Tracy turned to see that Nick did indeed have a disapproving look. Not that he could be blamed, considering she had basically cheated on the question. Nick took enchanting very seriously, so he was not amused by her actions at all. Yes, as you have just heard, different materials have different properties and abilities to hold enchantments. It is thus very important to know what each material is and what their properties and conductivity is by heart. If you would please pay attention to my table here, I will start explaining these common materials to you, so be sure to take notes, the professor said, while moving to stand behind the table. Nick was not surprised that the rest of the class was dedicated to the memorization of the material's properties and conductivity. The professor saw that Nick was reading a book, while most of the class was focusing on writing down the information he was giving them, but didn't mind, since he clearly expected such behavior from Nick. To his surprise, however, Tracy was also not paying attention either, and he learnt after asking that Nick had already stuffed this sort of metallurgy knowledge into her after she picked up smithing. At the end of the class, while everyone was leaving, the professor stopped Nick. Before you go, I would like to discuss a matter with you, he said in a friendly manner. Nick raised an eyebrow in surprise, but chose to stay behind anyways to see what this was about. Once the room was empty, the professor spoke up. This isn't about anything serious or anything, but more out of personal curiosity. Dumbledore has informed me that you managed to create a sort of compendium of enchantments, and I was wondering if I might look it over, he asked with a smile. 434. Chapter 434. Nick didn't mind at all and gave the professor the original version he wrote before he fixed it with Flamel and Dumbledore's help. The only other class Nick had was arithmancy, but he was disappointed to learn that everything that was going to be taught he had already learnt on his own, and thus dropped the class. This meant he only went to class twice a week, leaving him plenty of time for other activities that he wanted to work on. The largest of which was his blitzball idea that required a massive metal ring to be enchanted. Creating the ring was easy, as he merely needed to fill a huge mold with molten metal, which was easy since he merely used dragon steel for this step. The tricky part was the enchantment on the ring, however, as he needed to include a lot of functions to it. something to keep the water clear, clean, and warm. Something to suspend the water in the air without affecting the surroundings too much, while also keeping certain things at a certain level without gravity dragging them down that also didn't affect the players. All in all, the enchantment was stupid complex to complete, and while Nick knew he could have used multiple rings for this like with the Atronac 4, he only wanted to use a single one for this for aesthetic purposes. This project alone took him nearly all of September to complete from the sheer amount of space he had to cover, but it was finally done come October 1st. Now I just need to test it out and get the ball situated before I can hold tryouts for the first teams. Nick thought, as he left the realm he was using to hold the ring. Obviously, he hadn't slacked off on making the rings of protection and had crossed over 1,000,000 points already, though that number dropped immediately as he purchased the book on realm binding. At the moment, he was only at around 400,000 points after his diligent month of ring making. The book itself was, as one would expect, very, very complex and was taking Nick a while to thoroughly understand, since some of the concepts and terms needed background information to understand. He had expected this, however, so he wasn't worried about it. He had plenty of time until Grindelwald's plan was fully set in motion after all. What Nick didn't realize, however, was that there was a new group being formed from the loyal Death Eaters in Azkaban, led by none other than Bellatrix Lestrange. Wrath had overcome her when the dark mark that was finally recovered suddenly went out. Her anger so great that she regained her sanity and a cold purpose that maintained it. Thanks to the other criminals in the prison, she hatched a plan to escape by pooling all of their power and knowledge. Augustus Rookwood, in particular, provided a rough ritual that would in theory blast a huge hole in the prison. The fact he hadn't been directly executed was a huge mistake by the ministry, since as an ex-unspeakable, he had a vast array of forbidden or ancient knowledge in his head. He was never worried about escaping Azkaban, thanks to this, as he knew even without Voldemort he could escape. As an added bonus, the ritual would also tie all of the participants' magic together, letting them have a power even greater than Voldemort's if it was focused on a single person. What he hadn't accounted for, however, was that Bellatrix was no longer mad enough to mindlessly agree to anything and had modified her part of the ritual. She was not stupid, but rather quite clever, in fact, so she knew ancient runes and arithmancy to a good degree, enough at least to change the outcome of the ritual from empowering Rookwood to empowering her instead. The ritual circles were drawn in each of the cells via blood on the floor, and now they were all waiting for the day that would send a shockwave through the world, as the day someone actually escaped Azkaban, Samhain. The way the ritual worked was through a piece of forbidden magic that linked the magic of multiple people together with a single person set as the head of this new power. Apparently, it was designed by the ancient wizards as a military ritual to give an edge in battle. The problem, however, was that once bound together, it was nearly impossible to separate the wizards' magics from each other, and at the same time, it also opened the way for betrayal, as the total amount of magic didn't fall if one of the people died. This meant that if the head killed, the other they alone would have the full magical amount of everyone who was bound to the ritual in exchange. However, this ritual tended to make those who use it go insane. 435. Chapter 435. None of this concerned Nick, yet however, as he was totally unaware of it, and was currently creating the ball used for his new sport. It looked like a mix of a golf ball and a football, soccer ball, except it was white with blue wave patterns on it. It was made out of a special alchemical version of rubber that removed the drag that water would have on it without sacrificing durability and softness. It took Nick a couple tries to get the flow of the ball under water just right, but he did it. Next, Nick created the goals in the shape of two stylized triangles that were big enough for a person to have some difficulty protecting. These goals were connected to a magical scoreboard that kept track of the score. There was also a vibrantly colored piece of hard plastic in the center of the water that was the halfway point that the two centers of the teams used to fight over the ball at the start of a round or after one side scored. After thoroughly testing the field he had created, Nick was pleased to find was officially ready to be used. He created a total of 24 rings that allowed the wearers to see and breathe underwater, as if they were on normal ground, while increasing their physical stamina to cover the player's needs. With all of this done, Nick approached Dumbledore with his idea. "I must admit that I am very much fascinated by the idea of this new sport, but are you certain this won't make the Order move against you?" The old goat asked seriously. "I doubt they would care about a new sport being created by me unless I used it as a way to expose them, but I would need to be mental to try something like that." Nick said with a scoff. "Very well, I shall allow you to hold tryouts for this new sport. I assume you will use those two for advertisement, correct?" The old goat asked, and Nick nodded with a grin. "Of course, they do excel at grabbing attention after all," he said, with both of them chuckling at the small joke. They were, of course, referring to the twins who were positively vibrating in excitement at the new sport. Once Nick explained it to them. The biggest reason for this was that the rules were so relaxed that they could do things that would be considered fouls in Quidditch. For example, tackling the person with the ball. Not only was this not frowned upon in blitzball, but it was actually encouraged. The biggest reason for this was that, since everyone was swimming, nobody was moving fast enough to really cause all that much harm, unlike in Quidditch, where a tackle could be fatal if they fall wrong. This didn't mean that getting tackled underwater wasn't likely to hurt like hell. Anyways, the twins spared no effort to get the word out about the tryouts for the new sport. Things like flyers that got stuck to your face after flying through the school to screaming frogs that blared the tryout information placed all over the school. Filch was in a very bad mood during the week before the tryouts were actually held, and it showed from that number of detentions that got handed out. The tryouts themselves were held on the 21st, which was a Saturday, and only the third years and higher could apply, since below that, and the size difference becomes a big problem. At dawn on that day, Nick woke up at his normal time and left the castle with dusk on his shoulder, as per usual, while Steve had to walk instead to try and burn off some of that fat. The air had a bit of a nip to it, which made sense considering the date, but Nick ignored it as he made his way to the Quidditch pitch. It was of course empty, but that was planned this time, as he walked to the center of the field and released the giant ring into the air above him from the realm. Contrary to what some might think, the ring did not fall on him and crush him, but instead hovered in mid-air completely still. "Nen," he spoke, and a torrent of clear water shot out of the tip of his wand and strangely gathered into an orb at the center of the ring. The orb grew bigger and bigger until it was just shy of touching the ring at 50 yards across. Nick released the add-ons for the field that magically moved to take their rightful places as the scoreboard showed out on the side. Now to see just how good an idea this actually was, he thought while looking at his handiwork. 436. Chapter 436. Nick tapped his wand on the ground, and a white stone rectangle on its side rose out of the ground with black lettering detailing the rules of the game. The sport was much like Quidditch, in that the rules for play were actually fairly simple. The difference was that, unlike Quidditch, there wasn't a stupidly high amount of rules detailing what not to do. There were a few obvious ones, of course, like no holding another player for more than a minute, or no trying to remove other players' clothes. But most of these rules were just to make it clear where to draw the line for what was acceptable. Anyways, the rules for playing the game were that each score is worth 1 point, and each foul is worth -2 points. There are 6 positions on a team, and no replacement players per position unless the team recruits one. One can use their hands to move the ball or pass it to another player, but if trying to score, the ball must be kicked into the goal. No magic is allowed before or during a game, including potions, with the exception of the rings needed to play the game. The game can have a maximum of 4 quarters, each lasting an hour, or until a team gets a point lead in the case of the final 2 quarters. Other than that, the game was pretty much free reign for the players to move however they want. Nick was satisfied with these rules and tapped his wand against the ground again to create a large amount of chairs for those waiting to try out. After that, it was a matter of waiting for people to arrive at the pitch that no doubt drew a large amount of attention by now. How could it not, when it had a huge sphere of water floating above it that was clearly visible from the castle? Nick didn't need to wait long before the first person arrived, though it was not someone he had expected. McGonagall herself had come to see this new sport and seemed impressed, if the look she had was any indication. You never cease to amaze, Mr. Ravenclaw. This new sport seems well thought out, and you are clearly well prepared to hold tryouts, she said with a small smile. It had been on my to-do list for quite some time, to be honest with you. Frankly speaking, it boggles the mind how few magical means of entertainment exist despite the clear demand for it. Truthfully, I expect that Quidditch is only as popular as it is, since it's the only sport wizard kind has, Nick said with a shrug. Now that I ponder it myself, I believe you may be right. Regardless, I believe a reward is in order for the effort you have put into this project, and thus give 50 points to Gryffindor, she said with a sly smile. Nick laughed at this, as despite knowing she was merely using his work as an excuse to prop up her house slightly ahead of the rest, he wasn't going to point it out. He thought the point system to be a silly and pointless thing, and everyone knew it after all. The next people to arrive was the twins, who looked at the playing field eagerly. We thought you might have been overselling it, mate, but this lives up to the image we had of it for sure, Fred said with a wide smile, and George nodded in agreement. Like I told the professor here, it's been on my to-do list for quite some time now, though I am happy to hear it meets your expectations, Nick said, still smiling. Mind if we give it a go while you wait for the rest to show up? George asked while pointing at the field above. Did you read the rules? Nick asked while motioning to the list of rules nearby. No, Fred said sheepishly while scratching his head. You should do that first, then you need to transfigure your robes into a swimsuit and put on these rings before heading up into the playing field, Nick said seriously. You're the boss, they said simultaneously, shrugging. A few more people showed up as the twins were going over the rules and transfiguring their robes, but no one Nick felt any need to really acknowledge. The positions available were clearly shown in the rules, and Nick explained that he hoped there would be 4 teams by the end of the tryouts tomorrow evening. How do we even get up there anyways? Fred asked curiously while putting one of the rings on. Simple, really. Jump up, Nick said with a chuckle. 437. Chapter 437. The twins looked speechless at this answer, but decided to humor Nick and jumped as high as they could towards the water with their hands outstretched. To their surprise, the moment their fingers touched the water, gravity seemed to invert, and they fell into the field. Those watching this looked surprised and interested in trying it themselves. Nick noticed that the twins were holding their breath and felt the need to remind them that they can in fact breathe under water at the moment. Wicked, Fred said in a distorted way as the air left his lungs and they instead filled with water. Bloody hell, this feels strange, George said clearly after the air in his lungs got swapped with water. Nick picked up the ball he made and threw it into the water, and everyone watching seemed surprised to see it cut through the water without issue until it landed perfectly on the center piece of the field. The ball wasn't completely without drag or gravity, so Nick merely threw it in just the right way to get it where he wanted it. The twins swam around for a bit to get used to it before more and more people showed up and entered the field. Once the positions for 2 teams were filled by people trying out, Nick cut off the people entering the water while starting a mock game, so everyone could get a real look at the game being played. The twins chose the left and right attacker positions on one of the teams, and thanks to being the only players in good physical condition, made menaces of themselves. Blitzball was a game that heavily relied on one's fitness. After all, so they held a large advantage over people who never worked out a day in their lives. Unlike Quidditch, that heavily favored a single player, the fairness of Blitzball quickly got the people showing up more and more interested in the game. Literally, anyone could score in Blitzball, regardless of position, though goalies tended not to do that since they were needed to guard the goals. The first match ended after 30 minutes, with the Twins team obviously having won by a landslide. Even with the extra stamina given by the rings, only the Twins had the base stamina required to play a full game. Nick pulled everyone out of the field and had them swap with 2 teams that had formed while waiting. Not going to lie, mate, that was the most fun we've had in ages. Quidditch is fun, sure, but this. Fred paused to motion at the whole field overhead. This is way more to our tastes, George finished, while they both grinned like loons. I thought so, since you played the most physical positions on the Quidditch team. I am a bit worried about how out of shape everyone seems to be though, as that game was way too one-sided thanks to your advantage in fitness," Nick said honestly. "Aye, they made the rest of us look like a bunch of slugs with how well they handled the exercise," Seamus said bitterly from nearby. He had played the left defender on the team going against the twins and was a little worse for wear as a result. He had a few bruises from getting bulldozed by the twins, but was otherwise fine. Besides Quidditch players, I think most wizards are actually out of shape from overly relying on magic for everything. The new teams will need serious training to catch up, it seems," Nick said with a sigh. He had expected something like this, but had apparently underestimated how out of shape the average wizard was. "Yeah, but at least we have the potions to make it easier. Need to settle who all is on the teams first, though," Fred said seriously. Some of these folk can't even swim proper," Seamus said, while pointing at an older girl floundering in the water, as she clearly had no clue what she was doing. "Before that, we need to find out who will be the captains of the new teams, and as much as it may suck, people like would fill those roles best," Nick said, and the twins and Seamus groaned. Most good team captains were those that were responsible yet inspired loyalty in their team, but the ratio of those two things differed from person to person. Oliver Wood was more responsible than friendly, but still held the team together well enough. But the issue was finding someone at least similar who wanted to captain a team. There were a few, of course, but all of the choices were less than optimal. A good example was Malfoy, that fit the responsible description well enough, but failed on the personality front. 438. Chapter 438. Malfoy ended up captaining one of the teams and started to pick out his teammates. Nick had to make it clear that this was not to be a house team type situation and forced Malfoy to have members from other houses as well in his team. The rest of the staff at Hogwarts had also turned out for the tryouts and relaxed while watching the students play for the chance to join one of the new sports teams. Nick had created another stone board that he had the team's names with the players' names in their position in the team. The team names were chosen by Nick beforehand, much to Malfoy's displeasure, as he wanted to name his team. The names were all based off of powerful things that lived in the sea: the dragons, the krakens, the mermen, and the leviathans. Malfoy merely got to choose between these names for his team, and chose the dragon out of a misunderstanding that dragons were the apex of any environment they lived in. That wasn't the case, however, in the sea, as dragons tended to be eaten by both krakens and leviathans instead. Mermen were one of the names, not due to their danger rating, but because they were the only water-dwelling species to inhabit every part of the world, which told of a different sort of power. It was rather funny to see Malfoy's face when the twins directly rejected him after he tried to recruit them. Still, despite that he did get a team with decent potential cobbled together out of 3 Slytherins besides himself, and a Hufflepuff and a Ravenclaw. The gender ratio was also pretty good, as there were 4 boys and 2 girls. Nick wasn't familiar with the names of any of the others besides Malfoy, though so they clearly didn't stand out much. The second team took the name Leviathans and was led by Seamus Finnegan after he managed to convince a few people to join him. The team was comprised of 5 boys and 1 girl, though even if the house composition was great at 2 Gryffindor, 2 Ravenclaw, a Slytherin, and a Hufflepuff. Nick even recognized a few of the team members in the form of Anthony Goldstein, Susan Bones, and Blaise Zabini of all people. Blaise was not directly famous, but was well known because of his mother. She was a very attractive woman, apparently, and had been married several times. However, the thing that made her famous was how each marriage ended in the man dead. No one knew if it was just sheer bad luck or foul play, but she was labeled a Black Widow either way, and that infamy passed to Blaise as well. The poor boy hated it, though, and was avoided most of the time because of his poor temper. He wasn't a bad guy from Nick's observations, but simply assumed everyone was against him due to his mother's infamy, which, to be fair, was close to being accurate. No girl wanted anything to do with him in the off chance. He took after his mother in that regard, but most of the boys didn't care. The final 2 teams were populated by people he didn't know, though, save the twins who were part of the Merman team as attackers. None of Nick's friends wanted to play the game as part of an actual team, though, and joined Nick as part of an unofficial team led by him. He took midfield, while Luna took the goalie position, and Harry and Ron took the left and right defenders, while Daphne and Tracy were attackers. Hermione wanted no part of the sport, though, and watched from the side as Nick and the others showed how a real team should work. The twins found out the hard way that not everyone was below them in terms of fitness when they thought they could tag Team Nick when he had the ball. Merlin's beard, mate, where do you even go to get muscles like that? It was like hitting a wall and the wall won. Fred complained while massaging a bruise on his shoulder. I have my ways, and no, I won't be sharing them, so don't ask. Nick said with a chuckle. Why would you keep a body like that hidden, though? George asked, confused. It's not hidden, I just don't constantly go around showing it off without a good reason. Not that I haven't shown it off, mind you, just that it benefited me to do so. Nick said honestly. Whatever you say, man, but when's the first official match for this new sport anyway? Fred asked curiously. The 1st of November is what I have planned after I set up this field permanently a bit from here. Nick said calmly. 439. Chapter 439. Not giving us a lot of time to train, are you? Seamus asked with a frown. You won't need it if you train seriously with the help of the potions the twins have. On me, of course. Nick said with a grin. How are we going to train at the same time, though? There is only one field. Malfoy asked, confused. Nick's grin grew, and he removed 3 sets of extra goals and pointed at the black lake in the distance. You can either use the lake or figure out how to make a body of water large enough to practice in on your own. Though I suppose you could also share the field with another team when you train, he said with a chuckle at the looks of disbelief he got. Before someone says it, the Black Lake is going to be cold, but if you use a warming charm on yourselves before entering, you will be fine. He added to nip that argument in the bud. He even went so far as to teach them his own personal warming charm that lasted hours and worked underwater just fine. After that, the teams fought over who got to use the field first, while Nick left for the castle with his relaxation now good and set. He only decided to make a new magical sport, so he had something to do that wasn't work-related when he needed to relax. It also helped that, unlike Quidditch, he didn't have any bias against this new sport and might actually enjoy watching it get played. Time passed after that, and soon enough Halloween arrived, and a secret ritual was being held in the island prison of Azkaban. The perpetual bad weather of the island did nothing more than mask the sound of chanting in a particular part of the prison until it was too late to stop what was happening. Est omnia et omnia unum. These words were repeated a total of 7 times, and the blood ritual circles lit up in the cells. Each had a person standing within it as the magic took hold, but there was 2 people with different expressions involved in the ritual. Rookwood, who had a look of horror and unwillingness, and Bellatrix with a look of ecstasy. The white light of the majority of the ritual circles suddenly turned red, and screams of agony filled the air before leaving behind nothing but the cackle of a new and very powerful being. Bellatrix had miscalculated something when she modified her ritual circle to devour the others to empower her alone. She forgot to take into account the souls, vitality, and minds of those being devoured, and as a result, her body was flooded with all of them. The vast vitality and power purified her body and magical circuits, while the souls and minds that crashed into her own destroyed all of them as individuals and created an amalgam of all. Bellatrix nor any of the other Death Eaters existed anymore, but now there was a thing with all that experience and knowledge and more power than it knew what to do with. A monster had been born, and the only part of the people's personalities it had left was the overwhelming urge to escape the prison it was born into and endless hunger. With a wave of its hand, the creature released a pulse of energy that briefly clashed with the wards of the prison before overpowering them. The walls containing it then started to turn into sand and collapse as the monster walked out of the hole it made. The Dementors felt this disturbance and moved to intercept the monster, but froze at a distance as the being's unstoppable power rolled over them and began to devour them, adding to its power. The Ministry quickly learned of this escape and sent teams of Aurors to the island, But all they found was an empty prison and signs of a foul ritual in the cells of the former Death Eaters. The only clue they had besides that was that the escapee seemed to be Bellatrix Lestrange. Bounty posters and urgent newspapers went out in a matter of hours after that. Hogwarts was in a dreary mood as a result when the news arrived, and Nick had a very bad feeling about it. He wasted no time heading to Dumbledore's office and barging and interrupting a meeting with the staff. "You can get on to me later, but whatever this is has my instincts going nuts, and that is very bad. Not even those two caused me to feel this threatened," Nick said with visible fear. "Sybil here was saying something similar, and I am also inclined to agree with these feelings of yours. Something of terrible creation has been unleashed into the world," Dumbledore said sternly. 440. Chapter 440. "We need to know exactly what we are dealing with before we can make any preparations," Snape said seriously, and everyone was in agreement. "You have ears in the Ministry. What hasn't been mentioned in the news?" Nick asked the old man seriously, and Dumbledore thought about it for a moment. According to Dawlish, there were a few ritual circles drawn in blood in the cells near the one belonging to Bellatrix, he said honestly. Nick's eyes narrowed as he remembered a ritual he had seen in a book in the forbidden section. How many ritual circles exactly? He asked, hoping that it wasn't what he thought it was. 7 in total, but the one in Bellatrix's cell was different than the others, though similar, Dumbledore said, and Nick loudly cursed. "Sorry for the outburst. I need to see the circles myself to be sure, but I am pretty sure that I know what happened as well as what left that prison," Nick said with a huge headache coming on. "I need a book from the forbidden section of the library to explain my guess, though it's called War Magics and Combat Curses and has a faded black leather binding," Nick said seriously. "Give me a moment to summon the tome to this office," Dumbledore said as he clapped his hands, and a house elf appeared. He then told it to bring the book in question, and the elf vanished for a few minutes before reappearing whilst holding the book. Nick wasted no time grabbing it and rapidly flipping through its pages until he found what he was after. Placing the book on the desk, flat and open for all to see, he spoke again. "This is the ritual of unification, and despite its benign-sounding name, it is anything but. The ritual uses the weakening of the barrier to the spirit realm on this day to tie the magic of 7 wizards together, thus allowing them to effectively create a mage of extreme power. For example, if there were 7 wizards of Professor Snape's level of power, and they did this ritual, then any one of them could in theory have 7 times as much power than before the ritual," Nick said seriously, and everyone looked horrified at the implications that had but Dumbledore figured out the discrepancy from what happened on Azkaban. Only one person seemed to escape, though. The rest of the cells were still locked securely, he said, and Nick nodded. "That is because of this," he said as he turned the page and pointed at a passage that described what happened if one of the mages got greedy without understanding the ritual thoroughly. As the people in the office read through the passage, their expressions turned to horror and disbelief. "You don't think?" McGonagall whispered the question in horror, but everyone heard it. "I do. It explains why nothing was left alive in the prison. If it is one of these things, then it will keep devouring all forms of magic around it until it either gets destroyed or collapses in on itself from too much power being in a body not designed to hold it, neither of which are easy to accomplish," Nick said seriously. "Does the book say anything about how they were dealt with in the past?" Flitwick asked seriously, but Nick shook his head. "That passage is all the detail we have on this thing, as whoever wrote this book changed the topic after it, and I haven't seen any description of it in any other book, though I might be wrong. I tried to avoid the books on dark magic after all," Nick said honestly. "A wise decision. The corruptive ability of dark magic is greatly underestimated," Snape said seriously. "Severus, can I trust you to search the forbidden sections, dark magic books for any mention of this creature?" Dumbledore asked seriously. "I will see to it," Snape said just as seriously. "While Severus is looking for information, I want you to see if you can come up with an enchantment of some kind to contain this creature at least, until we can figure out how to safely destroy it," Dumbledore told Nick firmly. "I don't know if it is even possible, to be honest with you. Any magic near this thing will get eaten and empower it further, and no Muggle object can contain it for long. I will try, though." Nick said with a sigh. Dumbledore nodded. That is all anyone can ask of you. Should you need assistance in any way, please let us know so we can hopefully overcome this situation. He said, and everyone dispersed worried but hopeful for a miracle. 441. Chapter 441. Nick went straight to the Chamber of Secrets, or more specifically Slytherin's library, after leaving Dumbledore's office. There he searched for any mention of the ritual of unity in the books, but there was only a small chance that Slytherin had encountered this situation himself. The reason for that was because a creature like this treated wizards as snacks regardless of power, and he would be unlikely to survive such an encounter. Nick wasn't taking the time necessary to memorize any of this information as he was skimming for key words. It was only about halfway through the library that he found something about his query. Apparently, Slytherin had participated in a small war during his Middle Age period, and the side he was fighting for used the ritual, but intentionally modified it to create one of these abominations. They had essentially forcefully fused the 7 mages together into the body of a single mage, and escaped far away to watch the devastation. The thing was nigh unstoppable according to Slytherin, as it ate any magic it came across from spells to the wizards themselves. Nothing was spared. The muggles that comprised most of the army tried to kill the thing themselves, but it was also like an extremely powerful mage, as it merely waved its hands, and the muggles' weapons and bodies disintegrated. Slytherin asked the people responsible for the creation of this abomination how it could be stopped, but the answer he got dissatisfied, but him and Nick. There were 4 ways to stop this thing. First was to force it to use its entire store of magic, using muggle means, which was lethal to it. The second was to wait for it to explode from overeating. The third option was to banish it to a place without magic, thus starving it to death. The final option was to destabilize its mana core's balance, causing it to cannibalize itself. None of these were a good option, but at least they gave Nick somewhere to start with his enchantments. After skimming through the rest of the library and not finding any more information on the subject, using his key words, Nick left the chamber and went to his workshop. Once there, he began to brainstorm possible things he could make with what he knew now. At first, he thought about simply banishing it to a dimension without mana, but his mastery of spatial magic was lacking to pull it off. Sloppy work simply wouldn't work, as that would only feed the monster rather than trap it. Then Nick moved on to the idea of destabilizing the mana core of the creature, but that had its own complications. First and foremost amongst them was that he had to know where it was. Then he needed to get a spell past its magic somehow, and then he needed to destabilize the core as well somehow. I'll keep that as a last-ditch effort type thing. Nick finally moved onto the last and most doable of all the options, forcing the creature to run out of mana using muggle means. There was a few ways he could, in theory, accomplish this. The first was to quite literally drop a mountain on the creature from high up, forcing it to burn a large amount of magic to not get crushed. The second way depended on how much magic it took to stop a bullet heading towards you. If it was a lot, then Nick could simply create a magical gun that shot non-magical metal bullets, since he wasn't going to waste his time learning how to use a normal muggle gun. I think I need Flitwick's help with this one. Nick thought and left the workshop to find the good professor. It wasn't even that hard, since the half-goblin was in his nearby office tinkering with something to relieve some stress. "Did you need my help with your task?" Flitwick asked after seeing Nick, who nodded. "A muggle gun. Do you know how much magic it would take to stop a bullet from one?" Nick asked seriously. "Well, I am no expert on the subject, but depending on the method used, a lot, or an average spell's worth," Flitwick said after some thought. "And if you wanted to brute force the issue and disintegrate the bullet mid-flight?" Nick asked, hopeful of the answer. "That would take inhuman reflexes to even consider, but assuming it could be done, then I image it would take quite a lot of power. How does this relate to the problem, though?" The small professor asked, confused. "In theory, magic is the greatest advantage this thing has, but at the same time it is also its greatest weakness. See, all of that power is what drives and allows the existence of this creature. But what do you think would happen if it were to use its entire store of magic up?" Nick asked with a grin as Flitwick's eye widened as he realized what he was implying. 442. Chapter 442. The theory sounds promising, but the passage said that this creature is intelligent, so how can you stop it from fleeing without using magic after it realizes the danger it is in? Flitwick asked seriously, and Nick frowned. I hadn't thought of that possibility, but it would make sense for the creature to retreat from true danger. Considering spatial entrapment spells or wards would feed it instead of holding it in place. Stopping the creature from apparating would be nearly impossible. You wouldn't by chance happen to know of an energy that acts similarly to magic, but isn't magic, would you? Nick asked hopefully, but Flitwick shook his head. Nick sighed. I thought so. Still, I will let Dumbledore know about this theory and see if he can't acquire a muggle gun to be enchanted in secret. Despite the danger this thing poses, I have a feeling the Ministry would not take kindly to the enchanting of muggle weaponry. He said seriously, and Flitwick agreed. Nonetheless, thank you for your help in this matter. Nick said sincerely, but Flitwick waved it off as something he should do anyways. He was a teacher after all. After leaving Flitwick's office, Nick made his way to the headmaster's office and informed Dumbledore on the theory that Flitwick and himself had come up with on how to deal with the creature. The old wizard seemed impressed at the idea of using a muggle weapon to drain the magic of the creature in hopes of it consuming itself, and promised to quietly obtain a gun for this purpose. Unfortunately, though Dumbledore also didn't know of an energy that behaved like magic that wasn't magic, so trapping the creature was still not doable. They were both confident that it was possible, however, just that they need to discover the way. Nick went back to the chamber to try and find out if Slytherin may have the answer, since the resources available during the Founder's era were more diverse than those available now. Sad as it was, the bad habit of wizards to hoard and destroy information meant that the amount of ancient knowledge available during the Founder's era was considerably greater than the modern age, as those wizards from that time erased vast amounts of information when they died. Very few wizards left a physical copy of their knowledge behind, so, in a way, the wizarding world is still playing catch-up. This made Slytherin's library a priceless treasure, even if it couldn't be removed from the chamber. The wily old snake had bound each and every book of the library to this room, so only those he wanted to see it. Clearly, he hadn't expected that someone with soul-devouring abilities like Nick would have come around and destroyed him using his phylactery, so the library was not booby-trapped due to his confidence of victory in battle. That said, he clearly didn't trust whoever was supposed to read the library and made it impossible to take books from the room. That was fine by Nick, though, since he was steadily making copies of every book in the library for his own personal collection. Despite hoping that he would find some information of an energy that acted like magic, but wasn't in the books Slytherin left behind, there was nothing about it when he skimmed them. Ah, fine, I'll see if the system has anything on this, even though I wanted to save up points again. Nick thought with a sigh as he opened the shop and had the system pull up books on the subject he was looking for. I can't use any of these. Nick thought with a curse as he looked over the different types of energy that the shop had books on. The problem was that far too many of them were either heavily restricted innately, and thus unsuited to his purpose, or were so close to magic that he was almost certain that they would clash with it. While he could get these powers for the muggles in the world, that would definitely turn out bad in the long run. Humans had this bad habit of finding the smallest differences in each other and turning violent or cruel over it. It was already going to be very rough in a few years when Grindelwald's plan exposed magic to the Muggle world, and throwing another type of power into the mix would very much make things worse. Nick was frustrated that the easiest option was pretty much off the table thanks to this discovery. It was a pity, too, since some of these powers sounded very interesting. Like aura, for example, that granted something called a semblance, that was basically a superpower born from the manifestation of one's own soul. 443. Chapter 443. There were a few other types of energy that had interesting uses and implications, but unfortunately they either were too limited to be of use or so close to magic in how they operated that he wasn't willing to risk death to integrate them into himself. At least not until he become a nigh unkillable Daedric realm lord. On a related note to that idea, Nick had managed to digest roughly a quarter of the information in the book already, though that was mostly because that was how much he had the required knowledge for. It wasn't enough to begin binding himself to the realm properly, but it had done wonders for the way he used his connection to the realm to accomplish things there. For a true realm lord, the realm was a reflection of themselves, and thus mirrored them in appearance and thought, so while Nick wasn't even close to that, he had gotten better at exerting his will over the realm. A good example of this was the sun that had formed in the realm after he fed it the light material of the real sun. Before, it was just a small ball of magical energy set to behave like a sun. Now, though, it was a small but genuine star with a core and everything, though spatially isolated, to keep the heat and radiation from frying everything else in the realm. The moon of the realm was not changed, though, since that brought little benefit at the moment. It was thanks to this new mastery over the realm that Nick was able to gain a new and surprising ability, thought splitting. His mind had gotten so used to working on the realm and his normal thoughts at the same time that he could now maintain two separate thought processes at the same time. He was pretty sure that this was something that all magical beings got eventually, since it actually didn't feel unnatural at all, like a forced adaptation. In fact, it felt as if he was always meant to have something like this, but didn't know it until now. It's probably due to the increasingly complex nature of magical beings as they reach higher tiers of power. He thought as he practiced both his elemental bloodline abilities simultaneously. He had chosen to focus on his own power after failing to find a method to trap the creature that was easy. The best chance he had from what he could figure out, though, was to use a muggle means of spatial solidification as a trap, but the science behind such a thing was so complex that nothing even close existed on this version of Earth. He was unwilling to figure out how to do it himself, either, since he was clear that until Zeus was dealt with, magical things were all he had time to improve. Since he had reached this dead end, in regards to the creature, he turned his attention to self-improvement instead. Nick wasn't the sort to bang his head against a wall in hopes that it would solve the problem by sheer stubbornness after all. So he focused on mastering all that he had at his disposal, currently, such as his bloodline abilities and his ring making. There was one ability, though, that he simply couldn't master at his current level of power, surprisingly enough: weather manipulation. Even after reaching Tier 3, this ability was an absolute mana hog. He had expected this, however, considering where it came from. The celestial bird was a pinnacle Tier 4 creature minimum, and was likely a Tier 5 creature in reality. This meant the abilities Nick got from his soul fusing together with a small part of its own, while his body was transforming to match his soul, had this ability at that level. While this made it dangerous even to people like Flammel and Dumbledore, it also drained the appropriate amount of mana that such a power normally would. To put it bluntly, Nick was too weak to master this ability fully, and he knew it. Despite this, though, Nick still improved rapidly with his power and crafting mastery, as he even figured out how to change the light material into a shape beyond those it was attuned most. The trick, it turned out, was to inject his intent into the material when he was drawing it out. This kept the properties of the light, but changed the forms it was attuned to. Thanks to this, Nick could now use the style to make anything he wanted out of the material, including weapons and armor. Interestingly, though, the stylization of the light material remained the same despite the different form. 444. Chapter 444. Like that, a week passed, and it was finally time for the first ever Blitzball match to be held. The news of the new sport had gotten out, and the magical community worldwide was buzzing in interest. Despite this, though, Nick hadn't received any further warning from the Order of the Golden Sands, which showed they probably didn't care about this sort of thing, since no one would attach it to them if they were sane. The Blitzball field had been moved next to the lake for fast refilling, since it was drained at the end of every day. Due to the increasingly colder days, as winter showed its teeth, the giant ring that kept the water within warm needed more and more mana to operate if it wasn't drained, which simply wasn't worth it. Plus, the spectacle created from filling the field with water was entertaining to watch by itself. Anyways, Nick had pulled out all the stops to have a wide set of semicircular seats built up around the field so that many people could attend the game. This proved wise as people from all over the globe, and many reporters showed up for this first game to test the waters, as it were. Nick saw all of this from the Black Lake, where he was waiting to make a grand entrance to announce this first match. In a rare show of solidarity, the entire school had shown up to watch this match, from the professors and students to even Filch and his cat. The staff of the school, of course, had designated seats in the dead center of the bleachers, so that they had the best possible view, but everywhere else was first come, first serve. The crowd was already bubbling with nervous and excited energy when Nick got the ready signal from the two teams playing. Nick grinned at this and waved his wand from his place under the water, and immediately 4 thick geysers of water shot high into the air from the lake. The crowd looked panicked at this, until the water that was falling towards them instead got pulled into the center of the ring, which drew many gasps of amazement. Nick then floated out of one of the geysers riding on one of his brooms and hovered above the top of the ring as it gathered water. Sonorous. He spoke and held his wand tipped to his throat. Welcome, one and all, to the first ever Blitzball match. Allow me to introduce myself. I am the creator of this sport, Nicholas Ravenclaw. Nick spoke grandly, and the crowd went wild as his voice rang out loudly through the area. Nick held up his free, and then the crowd went silent again, eager to hear what he had to say. Before the match can begin in earnest, I would like to give special thanks to all the teachers and staff of Hogwarts who made this entire event possible. Please give them a warm round of applause, Nick said, and there was loud clapping from majority of the crowd. Dumbledore and the other professors minus Snape smiled and took the applause with poise and grace. With that out of the way and the field now in place, I would like to introduce the two teams who will be participating in this historic match. Nick said loudly, and from the lake geysers 6 figured fell in formation into the water of the field before gathering and posing. Lead by Seamus Finnegan, the Leviathans. Nick said, hyping the team up as the crowd went crazy. Professor McGonagall was kind enough to design a set of uniforms for the team based on the creature they were named off. In this case, sleek dark blue full-body suits that had large, hard-looking scale patterns from the neck down and fins on the elbows, hands, and feet. They were posed in a serpentine manner like the beast they were named after. Soon after, another 6 shadows shot out of the water geysers and into the field before grouping up and posing themselves in opposition to the other team. Lead by Draco Malfoy, the dragons, Nick said grandly, and the crowd was losing its collective mind from the hype. Malfoy designed the outfit of his team, and despite the clothes being a mix of gold and azure, they actually looked pretty good. Like the outfits for the other teams, the outfits were full-body suits, but this time they had small, intricate azure scale patterns from the neck down that had golden stripes placed randomly on each suit. Much like the Leviathans, the dragons were also in a serpentine formation, though there was 2 members acting as claws that were also coincidentally or not the attackers of the team. 445. Chapter 445. As if under perfect understanding, the 2 teams swam in formation around the other like they were sizing up the other side, before suddenly swimming straight into each other, as if to clash. Instead of colliding, however, the 2 teams broke formation at the same time, and the members glided through the water past the members of the other team, before perfectly settling into positions on the field to start the game. The exceptions to this were the goalies that needed to swim a bit longer to reach their respective goals. I will be serving as the referee of this match, as well as the server for the ball, so without further delay, let's begin the match, Nick said as he stored the broom in the realm and fell down into the field himself. He had on a highly visible silver bodysuit that had a large black badge pattern on the chest and back to show his role in the game. He gracefully swam down to the platform in the middle of the field with Malfoy and Seamus at either side of him. This is the first match of this game ever, so play well and make it one these people won't forget, got it? Nick said seriously, and both captains nodded seriously. Nick didn't say anything else after that, but took the ball out of the realm and crouched down to serve it. He threw the ball straight up with a whistle, and the game began as both Seamus and Malfoy shot up after it. Malfoy gets the ball and immediately passes to Larrett. Lee Jordan narrates the match from the stands like he normally would for Quidditch. Nick, meanwhile, had immediately swam towards the bottom of the field so he could see everything better. It was clear that both teams had trained hard with the time he gave them as they started the match out strong. The left attacker for the Dragons, who had the ball, was making a beeline for the Leviathans' goal, but was stopped by the right attacker and defender from the Leviathans, who moved to tackle. The Dragons' attacker clearly wanted to break through the two tackles, however, but failed and lost the ball to the defender of the Leviathan, who threw it to Seamus, who was still at midfield waiting. The throw was just strong enough for Seamus to receive it, and he shot towards the Dragons' goal. Malfoy was not far behind alongside the right defender, as the other two available players were too far away to assist. Seamus got within scoring distance and stopped to try and make a goal when Malfoy and the defender got between him and the goalie. Seamus grinned and lightly tossed the ball upward before leaning backwards as he brought his feet up and his arms outwards. Malfoy looked confused at this until it finally happened. Seamus rocketed his feet out in a double kick to the ball that was bulleted forward. The ball was moving far too fast, and Malfoy far too slowly, so a loud thud sounded out as the ball impacted his face before ricocheting backwards. Seamus had backflipped into an upright position by this time and moved to reobtain the ball as the defender also scrambled to get it. The defender got his hand on the ball, but Seamus changed to a tackle and slammed into his opponent. Gah! The defender yelled upon impact, but passed through the tackle without losing the ball and immediately threw the ball to the right attacker of the Dragons. The crowd was watching this match at the edge of their seats as the ball got passed around, and there were a few near misses when someone went to score. The final result of the first quarter was the Leviathans leading at 3 points to the Dragons 2. The second quarter was also the final, as the Dragons managed to eke out a close victory at the last moment of the quarter, with the final scores being 8-7. Once the match was over, the two teams shook hands to show that there was no hard feelings and swam to the bottom of the field and then out of it. As the players and Nick left the field, it was time for the most irritating part of any sport, dealing with the crowd. Mr. Ravenclaw, a word please. Captain Malfoy, a quick interview. Shouts of this sort filled the air as the journalists all scrambled to get a scoop. Those not aware of the heartless nature of the press, from the teams, fell prey to the reporters, but both Malfoy and Nick knew better than to stop to talk with any of them. 446. Chapter 446. To be more specific, they both knew that the trick to dealing with the press was to get them in a controlled environment. Once the reporters were in an environment that was controlled, they had to maintain a certain level of civility, unlike when they were out in the open in a large crowd, and could overwhelm someone with questions. Malfoy was definitely not going to miss this chance to raise his own prestige by using the media to his advantage like his father had taught him. Nick, on the other hand, would prefer to not deal with the reporters at all, but he needed to as the creator of this new and clearly well-received sport. The reporters also knew this, which is why they weren't bothered by him ignoring them while they had the advantage. It helped that interviewing him was not high on the list of priorities at the moment, what with the match needing to be reported first. The visitor that Nick was most interested in meeting was none other than Ludovic Bagman, the head of the games department at the ministry. Bagman was a gambling addict and was almost constantly in debt as a result, which made him easy to manipulate if the correct means was used. As the head of the games department, Bagman actually had quite a heavy amount of power when it came to matters involving sports in the British community. If he wanted to, he could ban blitzball in the Isles entirely, since it wasn't large enough yet to cause him problems for doing it. Nick doubted the man would do something like that, though, considering the sheer pressure Fudge would put on him for such an action. Without a single doubt in his mind, Nick knew for a fact that Fudge was definitely thinking about the sheer profit this new sport would bring to the British Isles. How could he not when the other ministries would get word of this new sport and all come scrambling to him to get a slice of this new and tasty pie? Nick wasn't wrong either, as over the next month, the magical community was going ballistic over the new sport. Petitions to have the sport introduced to these other countries flooded the various ministries. Fudge and Bagman, of course, came calling at about the middle of the month, along with about 12 different reporters from different news agencies to discuss the future of Blitzball. With how often you seem to have these little meetings with me, I am tempted to have a Minister of Magic seat specially made for you here. Nick joked with Fudge as the man entered the workshop. It can't be helped, I'm afraid. You keep doing things that require my presence here. Fudge said, exasperated. Nick was aware that this exasperation was less because he was tired of dealing with the consequences of Nick's actions, but because Nick was rapidly turning into another hegemonic entity like Dumbledore in the British Isles, which made him feel threatened. The problem was that Nick wasn't involved in the political scene despite his growing power there, and Fudge refused to make a move that would potentially cause Nick to utilize that power against him. It was a classic rock and hard place type scenario, as on one hand Fudge wanted to curb Nick's rise to power, but on the other he might accelerate it instead if he moved against him. Nick was aware of this problem that Fudge was having, but had only disregard for the man's foolish thoughts. Nick could care less about the petty politics of the world at this moment, when in a few years the whole world is going to be operating on a totally different form of governance. Whether it was Zeus or himself in the end, one of them will end up taking the crown on the entire world in some way or another. Let's get straight to the heart of the matter, shall we? Blitzball, I have it, and the whole world wants it. Nick said casually. The reporters were writing furiously in their notebooks, while Fudge and Bagman both sighed when they realized that this wasn't going to be easy. Nick had the absolute upper hand in this conversation, since he and he alone knew the true details of the game's mechanics. I won't lie and say that isn't true, as the various ministries all over the globe have indeed requested access to the game. Mr. Bagman and myself are here to try and convince you to turn over the game to the ministry so that we can handle it on a wide scale. Fudge said honestly. And what do you have to offer for such a thing? And don't try to say glory and gratitude, because I already have plenty of that, Nick asked calmly. 447. Chapter 447. That was the crux of the issue, the true reason why Fudge and Bagman were here, and they knew it. This wasn't the sort of case where they can hand over some sort of small thing and rake in the profits for themselves. Nick was far too smart to accept something like that. He hadn't made some new potion that could be copied with enough effort, but a genuine sport, which can't be replicated without him willingly giving up its secrets or years, maybe even decades of money-draining experimentation. Fudge and Bagman both grimaced when Nick posed this question, as it directly poked them where it hurt, the wallet. I may be able to get you a first-class Order of Merlin and an exemption from the laws you are breaking on that island of yours, Fudge said with a frown, but Nick was not moved at all. I want a week of unrestricted access in the archives and 10% of all profits from the Blitzball games in the future for as long as I live on top of that, he said calmly. What archives? Fudge asked with a frown, as that was the only part he wasn't expecting. The profits he had expected to be demanded, and he was even pleasantly surprised at how low the amount Nick wanted was, but he had no clue what archives Nick was referring to. The archives of knowledge, belonging to the Department of Mysteries, of course. I'm surprised you weren't aware of it, since I was even able to find records of them in the school library, Nick said with a mocking smile. A nifty little fact about the Department of Mysteries was that as time went on they started to slowly hide certain locations and activities from the rest of the ministry. The Lost Archive, the Archive of Knowledge, the testing facilities, and even the training grounds were all deeply hidden from everyone not a part of them in the ministry. Fudge was turning red from rage as he realized what Nick was all but pointing out. He was not aware of everything in the ministry that he was in charge of. Bagman seemed oblivious to this and chose to try to negotiate Nick down from his price. 10% of everything is far too much. What about 2% annually? He said like he was being generous. 5% of everything for as long as I live, and a month unrestricted access to the archive. Nick countered calmly. He halved his profits, but quadrupled his time in the archives. Something seems off about this. Fudge thought with narrowed eyes, but he was too much of a fool to understand Nick's motives. He didn't care about the profits at all. No, what Nick wanted was access to the vast collection of knowledge that the Department of Mysteries was hoarding. The Department of Mysteries had been collecting ancient tomes and research since the founding of the ministry so very long ago, and likely had information that, if released, could push the whole wizarding world forward by centuries. The biggest problem was not Fudge agreeing, however, but the department trying to play tricks by denying Nick access to the true archives, but giving him a small, carefully picked selection. They could also choose to try and directly kill him, but they would be in for a rude awakening if they did. 3% annually is the best we can offer, Bagman said, as if he was really struggling to say that. Nick scoffed at the man's shameless act, as he knew for sure that the annual profits compared to those from everything would be drastically different, and not in a good way. Not to mention that the British ministry will likely be taking at least 20% of all profit from the sport, as its creator Nick would be expected to get a tidy sum of profit off everything as well. Bagman was basically trying to filch what by all rights was a very fair amount of profit from Nick. 4% of everything and 2 months unrestricted access to the archives, final offer. Nick said firmly, since he had already grown tired of dealing with them. Bagman looked unhappy with this price, but looked at Fudge since technically he had the final say in this matter. Fine, the ministry can accept these terms. Fudge said, clearly unhappy with how this entire conversation went. He looked even worse, however, when he saw Nick take out a sheet of parchment from seemingly thin air that had dense writing on it already. Nick tapped the piece of paper, and a few words on it changed before he handed it over. Feel free to read the contract over to make sure the details are correct before you sign it, he said with a smile. 448. Chapter 448. Fudge carefully read through the contract and frowned as, despite being certain that Nick had placed a trap in the thing somewhere, he couldn't find one. All the terms were correct, and even the specified punishment was pretty standard issue. Little did he know that there was a trick in the contract, but that the reason he couldn't find one was that it wasn't targeted at himself, but the Department of Mysteries. Nick had placed the words, "the entire collection of," in front of the archive of knowledge, which meant that the department could not play the partial collection trick on him. He also specified that any attempts on his, or those close to him's life, freedom, mind, or soul, to prevent his part of the deal would be seen as a breach of contract by those responsible, and thus forfeit their lives to him. This in turn was his way of fully tying the department's hands against him in any way. They would have no choice but to give him his part of the deal, even if they wanted nothing more than to prevent that. Fudge saw no traps in this contract, and with some reluctance signed his name as the Minister of Magic, thus binding the entire ministry to it, as well including the Department of Mysteries. After Nick also signed the contract, the parchment flew into the air and duplicated itself so that both sides of the deal had a copy. Nick then took out a folded sheet of parchment from the realm and handed it over with a smile. This sheet of parchment has everything you need to replicate the entirety of the sport, other than the players themselves, as promised. It was a pleasure doing business with you, Nick said with a chuckle at Fudge's sour expression. The reporters had recorded every part of that interaction, and were all dying to publish it to let the world know that blitzball would soon be made a global wizarding sport like Quidditch. The more astute of them had also noticed a conspiracy that Nick had all but revealed about the Department of Mysteries. It would take a bit of research, but a few of them would eventually discover what it was before vanishing mysteriously when they tried to share it. None of this concerned Nick, though, as he had gotten what he wanted from this event, and was looking forward to the juicy secret knowledge that would soon be his. Pav Gareth Greengrass / head of the Department of Mysteries. I had not been having a great day after Minister Fudge returned from discussing the terms of the new sports release to the ministry with its creator. First was that the centuries of work that my department had done to hide certain things from the rest of the ministry had been undone by the brat in one foul swoop. To top it off, there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it, since it had already happened, and the brat had placed a heavy trap in the contract for us. We simply couldn't make a move on the brat, or anyone close to him, in any meaningful way due to the contract. This included using the power of time to travel back to before the contract was signed, since this would count as a breach of the contract in the present, and thus kill the person making the attempt. He got us good this time. I thought with more than a little irritation while dealing with the furious yelling of Fudge. The funny part of this situation was that we were actually thinking about recruiting the brat after he graduated, as he had shown his brilliance and curiosity towards magic that were high-value traits for this department. Now, though, we had this potentially horrible situation on our hands in which the vast library of knowledge we had accumulated gets used by a non-member. For each member of the department, there was a special contract binding them that kept them from leaking department secrets that weren't public in some form. But for the brat, he had no such contract, and thus was free to share anything he found in the archives. Did the boy say when he would be coming to visit the archives? I asked Fudge, after he calmed down enough to answer without yelling profanities at me. No, he didn't say exactly when he would be visiting this archive of yours. Fudge said spitefully. That wasn't good news at all, since it meant that the brat could in theory just never claim his full 2 months in the archive, and thus leave him untouchable to us. I could only pray that the brat proved incapable of understanding the ancient lost language texts in the archive that we haven't translated yet. 449. Chapter 449. Nick was aware that the longer he took to claim his reward, the more nervous it would make the people from the Department of Mysteries, but he didn't care. Before he even thought about going through that vast collection of knowledge, he wanted to digest Slytherin's library first. Nick couldn't really explain it, but he had this feeling that doing so as soon as possible was what he needed. This meant that every second he wasn't in class or rapidly churning out rings of protection, he was in the Chamber of Secrets reading through the library. Flitwick also managed to discover an oddity about the first-year boy that he revealed to Nick. Mr. Burnham always overcharges his spells. At first, I believed it to be from his lack of experience with magic, but after so many classes, I can honestly say this is not the case. If it's not too much trouble, can I ask what it was that you noticed about him that was different? The small professor asked curiously. As should be obvious by this point, I am rather sensitive to magical energies, and during the sorting ceremony I noticed that his was different than normal. Nick said honestly. In what way? Flitwick asked curiously. Do you know why vampires are unable to cast spells like a normal wizard? Nick answered with another question. The half-goblin fell into thought at that, but shook his head when he came up with the idea that the child was a vampire. Jonathan Burnham had none of the signs of being a vampire, so that idea was immediately discarded. But beyond those, Flitwick simply didn't know much about vampirism and could only tell Nick that he wasn't aware of why they couldn't use normal magic. Then, are you aware of the magical core that every magical being has and how it works? Nick asked calmly. I understand the basics, but I am no expert on the subject. How does it relate to vampires, though? Flitwick asked, since he couldn't see the issue. Nick didn't blame him, since as far as he knew, magical circuits were a closely guarded secret by those aware of them and their importance in wizards. The magical core in a wizard uses a special set of pathways in the body in order to allow us to use magic as we do. For vampires, their magical cores instead send all of their magic into their blood, thus removing the ability to cast magic as we do. The thing that I noticed immediately from that boy was that his magical core did both simultaneously, which I didn't even think was possible naturally. But it is clear that his body has always been like this to me from how relaxed the flow of magic is. Nick explained seriously, and Flitwick's eyes widened. Does this mean he is a vampire after all? He asked worriedly. Nick shook his head. His magical energy is completely human and has no trace of vampiric influence at all, which was why I was interested about what was so special about him. He says honestly, I see this is indeed a strange case if nothing else, perhaps the start of a new magical bloodline ability. Flitwick suggested, but Nick shook his head again. I don't think this is such a fundamental change as to now be a part of his genetic code. If anything, I believe he might have had a slight magical mutation very early in his life, which created this situation over time. Unfortunately for him, this can be considered a blessing and a curse for him, as while his power will likely be astoundingly high, as he matures I believe he may have serious trouble controlling it, Nick said honestly. Is there anything we can do to help him control his power? Flitwick asked hopefully. Practice. He needs an intense and regular amount of practice to even start grasping his power. Here this method should work well, Nick said before writing down the thread training that he himself did alongside the spell used normally for it. Flitwick looked at the information with a shocked expression. This might seem easy, but I imagine at a certain point this method will be torturously hard to advance in, the small professor said seriously. It is. I personally can only accurately control 17 threads, and I have been using this method since my first year. Nick agreed. I suppose we can only hope that he can stick to practicing this then, Flitwick said with a sigh. Nick chose to put the matter out of his mind after that since he was busy with other things like expanding his own arcane mastery using Slytherin's library. 450. Chapter 450. That is what Nick had been doing for most of the month after the first Blitzball match ended, and he had made several great strides in his digestion of Slytherin's recorded knowledge. The first of them was that he had gained a more pronounced understanding of the ancient spell casting method that was used at that time. It was similar to how the Celebrimber style used his will and knowledge to enchant things, except this used those to create a spell from one's wand. His mastery of the Celebrimber translated over well, but still left several gaps in his use of the spell casting style that Slytherin's library was patching up nicely. The second great stride he made was learning the rituals that Slytherin himself used during his youth to grow his power, as well gain a few benefits that Nick thought would be handy. One of the rituals was the ritual of nature that Nick had himself undergone. But there was also another two rituals that Slytherin used that, while not directly growing his power, sped up his magical growth drastically. The first was the ritual of expansion that caused one's magical core to grow smaller but produce more dense mana despite what the name would have you think. The requirements for this ritual was to sacrifice 4 limbs, a torso, and a head each from different magical beasts. The one casting the ritual also needed to soak the location of their magical core in a special potion for 7 days and 7 nights before undergoing the ritual. The second ritual Nick found was the ritual of clarity that strengthened one's mana circuits, allowing them to endure greater stress without leaking mana. This ritual was thankfully a simple one that involved a few rare plants, but that was it really beyond the timing that needed a full moon. There were a few other new rituals that Slytherin underwent, but none of them really appealed to Nick beyond those two. The third great stride was the discovery of the potential sealing location for one of the remaining guards. Slytherin had apparently been a part of a group of wizards that joined together to explore ancient tombs or mysterious magical places. The location of the sealed guard was in what was known as Snaeland at the time, but was in modern times referred to as Iceland. Slytherin records that the location of the impenetrable magical tomb was located under a large glacier at the southernmost part of the land, near a volcano. The tomb had only been discovered originally after a wizard had been searching for a certain magical beast in this area, but was caught in an ambush by an enemy, and the crossfire blasted some ruins into view. The wizard then sought out helpers to explore this new set of ruins after dispatching their enemy. Slytherin later placed concealment wards over the place once they failed to get past the horrible magical traps that were made of metal. To Nick, this sounded like the work of the smith guard Hephaestus, as neither of the other 2 sealed guards had any affinity with crafting traps, much less metal from Nick's understanding. Iceland was also isolated enough that Nick could see an scorned individual like Hephaestus holing up there. The possibility of the place not being a sealed guard's location, but a genuine tomb for a very powerful wizard, was also equally possible, but something told Nick he needed to visit the place to know for sure. Looks like I need to plan a trip to Iceland, he thought with a sigh. Besides all that, though, Nick was mostly absorbing the various theories and rules that Slytherin recorded in his library for the various different fields of magic he knew. The greatest of which was Slytherin's studies on healing magic that, while dark in some parts, were comprehensive if nothing else. The man was thorough in his experiments on captured foes or muggles that stumbled across him, and had detailed notes on what did what to who and why it did that. Nick absorbed this information like a sponge, and was confident that he would be able to put many Mediwitches to shame by the time he fully absorbed Slytherin's knowledge. By the start of December, Nick was practically a different person from how much progress he made into the library, and it showed. He felt older to those around him, like he had seen ages come and go. There was nothing for it, unfortunately, as when you read someone's entire life, including their inner thoughts on a subject, their personality will inevitably rub off on you to a degree. Slytherin was a calculative and callous person that was a firm believer of the ends justifying the means, and a small part of that had been taken into Nick's own personality.